Good evening, everyone, and welcome to another exciting edition of the FRSecure CISSP Mentor Program. I will be your instructor tonight, Ryan Cloutier, President of Security Studio and Virtual Chief Information Security Officer. Tonight, we're going to be closing out the remainder of Domain 7, picking up from where Evan left us on Wednesday, and we'll be going through the entirety of Domain 8. It is going to be a bit long this evening. We have a lot of content to cover, so please hang in there. This will be the last class where we go through deep content. The remaining two sessions will be about practice and practice exams and review. So hopefully everyone can stay here with us throughout the evening. And if I could just get a quick confirm in the chat that everyone is able to hear me, we will get this rocking and rolling right away. All right, I believe we are good. So here we go, off to the races. We do have some FRSecure folks that'll be monitoring chat for us. I also have a chat window open, so if it looks like I'm rolling my eyes, I am simply checking the chat. And here we go. Okay, one more button. Yay! All right, so quick reminder, housekeeping. Let's keep the chat respectful. No religious speak. Be an adult. Keep it on topic. I think we've covered this exhaustively, so everyone, I trust to do well. And no sharing of any copywritten content. We don't want to get in trouble. Thank you much. Quick reminder who I am. I am your instructor for this evening. Speaking human about tech is my superpower. Tonight, we're going to cover a lot of new ground, and there'll be a lot of new terms. So please do ask a lot of questions. And if for some reason we can't answer them immediately, we will get back to you a little bit later on. Some study tips for you. Again, small amounts frequently is the most effective way to study. Flashcards, practice apps, they can help a lot. Getting some sleep in between, heavy topics. Tonight's going to be a heavy topic. We're going to be talking closing out security operations and then talking software development security. And so if you are unfamiliar with or new to software development, this can be a pretty heavy domain. Use the Slack channels and try to exercise and get fresh air as much as you can. Shout out to Evan for wrapping up a great class last week. It was a lot to get that done in the short time frame. So really good to see him do that. I always like listening to him teach. And so we've been blessed this year with him teaching a few classes. We are very close to the finish line. It is exciting. So make sure you're going back and studying as much as you can. Do ask questions, do check in. How many of you have read all of Domain 7 and all of Domain 8? Hopefully all of you, so that some of this will be familiar. Tonight is going to be long. We are covering 211 slides. Not a lot of memes tonight. Definitely kept a few dad jokes just so we have some breaks and levity in all this heavy content. But it is going to be pretty long. I will talk somewhat quickly to try to keep us on track, but I do expect this to go a little bit longer. Make sure that you are reading the book. There are things I'm going to glaze over that you really need to read and cover in the book. So just know to do that. So before we get too far into it, the obligatory dad joke. It's inappropriate to make a dad joke if you're not a dad. It's a faux pas. Ha 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 ha. I can hear the laughter. All right, so picking up where we left off, patch management. This is where we left off last week, and the last slide that Evan shared. We'll open with this and continue forward. So as a reminder, patch management is the activity of addressing vulnerabilities that have been discovered. So part of patch management is that vulnerability detection, running those vuln scans, and looking for vulnerabilities. It could be that you become aware of a vulnerability because a security researcher has made you aware of this, a user has reported it to you, or you yourself maybe have discovered a bug. Patch publication, this is when the vendor puts out a fix for a known vulnerability. The most infamous vendor that does this is Microsoft, and we have those come out on Tuesdays. We call it Patch Tuesday, and some of us call it Chaos Wednesday. You want to evaluate. So you might be in a situation where a patch comes out and your system is vulnerable to it, but the impact of applying that patch may create more risks than the fixing of that vulnerability addresses. So we always want to keep that balance in mind between cost and benefit, and cost being financial, but also non-financial. Things that are going to disrupt the systems, things that are going to be cumbersome or burdensome to the end user, a lot of times can actually increase risk. We want to make sure that we're testing our patches. So this is just good environment management, right? We should be testing any changes, really, including patches that we plan to apply to the environment. And then we want to track it. So after we apply the patch, we want to actually keep an eye on things for a little bit and make sure that we haven't introduced any negative impact or unintended consequences. If we have, then having a rollback plan or rollback strategy is very important. With cumulative updates, for example, sometimes it can be difficult to roll back. You actually need to restore to a previous backup or virtual shadow backup that you've made. Sometimes you can't just uninstall a patch. So making sure you understand the rollback plan and you have that documented and ready to go should you need it. Very important part of patch management. And then lastly, documentation. It's important to understand what we've done, when we're doing it, who did it, how and when. So as much as possible, you want to have documentation around the patch itself, around the process for managing and deploying patches, as well as any unintended consequences that might have arose as a result of applying that patch. So patch management is important. Now we're going to talk about vulnerability management. Vulnerability being one half of the risk equation. If we remember, risk is likelihood and impact. And just because a vulnerability exists doesn't automatically mean that a risk exists. You can have vulnerabilities that are very, very difficult to exploit or not exploitable or are impractical. And in those cases, you don't have a risk, you just have a vulnerability. But some of the ways that we go about managing vulnerabilities are using skills like threat hunting. So threat hunting is the practice of looking for threats that maybe the existing security solutions have not discovered or are unable to detect. This could be looking for patterns and behaviors in the log files. This could be looking at network traffic. This could be doing code analysis against applications. But really what we're doing is we're hunting for the threats. Human testers are a key part of threat hunting. Automated tools are very helpful, but without proper context, business context and risk context, again, just because it's a threat doesn't automatically mean there's an impact. So we want to use that human combo with our software or other security tools that we're using to make sure that we're actually framing this up correctly. Vulnerability scanning is going to be exactly that. It's software that's going to scan for known vulnerabilities. So just like antivirus, vulnerability scanning can only find what has already been identified. It's looking for signatures, it's looking for pattern matching of known vulnerabilities. The National Vulnerability Database is a common repository where vulnerability scanning tools go to get the latest set of vulnerabilities so that they know what to look for. Red teaming, this is going to be a targeted form of testing for vulnerabilities. Red teaming sometimes is overlapped with pen testing. They are not the same thing. There are some shared elements, but they are not a one-to-one. Red teaming really is more of a what could I do? Pen testing is going to be that human run test. So red teaming a lot of times is a lot of tools and some human effort. Pen testing, if done right, is human run test. It's going to be broader in scope than a red team. It's going to be a lot of times very specific, Bug bounties are also going to fall under that umbrella. So pen testing and bug bounties tend to fall in the same group. Generally, there's rules of engagement that you're going to be limited in what you can test. And in the case of a bug bounty, a lot of times you're able to document your findings, but not exploit what you found. So for example, if a company goes to one of the bug bounty services and says, hey, we're putting out a bug bounty for any vulnerabilities that you discover in our systems, they're going to set up a rule of engagement that says that if you find it, you document it, you say what you could do, but that you're not actually allowed to go through with exploiting that vulnerability. And that's done for a variety of reasons. Main reason is safety and stability. Change management, super important and often overlooked. So change management is going to be the process, systems, policies, and procedures that you have in place for moving a system from one secured state to another. Change management are things like upgrading the software version, applying a new patch, adding or removing permissions. And it comes in three primary buckets. Standard change is going to be very low risk. Standard change are things like I've added a new user. We know that's a very low risk thing, no big deal. Am I frozen? Okay, sorry, Katie was having a little issue there with the internet connection. So standard change is low risk and generally is considered unlikely to have a negative impact. A lot of times it's going to be a pre-approved change. A lot of times it's going to be an automated change. And this is done to reduce operational overhead. So we've evaluated the change. We've decided that it's a very low risk that something would go wrong with it. And if something does go wrong, we've got really good plans for how we're going to roll back and address it. That becomes a standard change. Now, normal change is going to be more rigorous. This is we're adding new functionality to the software. We're migrating versions of the database. We're upgrading the OS. We're moving it to the cloud, right? Something a little bit more in depth. This is going to go through the full change management process. It's going to go through a request process, a review process, and ultimately a review and approval process. So some of the ways that we do that are through things like change boards. Now, change boards come in a couple different flavors. You have a change advisory board or a CAB. You could have a change control board or a CCB. You could have a change review board or a CRB. So the idea there, though, is it's a cross-functional group of stakeholders from across the business, representing both IT as well as the business functions themselves. And in that meeting, you're looking at the change, the impact the change could have both positively or negatively if something goes wrong. You're looking to make sure that you have planned for this change in case it creates outage or downtime, that you have processes in place to roll this change back if it doesn't work out, and that everyone is on the same page with why the change, what the change, how the change, which is something you might yell when you're frustrated, how the change. But it really is to make sure that you've been as thoughtful as possible in addressing any risks that change could present. And then there's emergency changes. Now, emergency changes are unplanned, right? They just happen. Now, that doesn't mean they're without rigor. That doesn't mean they're without some step of review and approval, but generally speaking, they're going to be very lightweight in the rigor, because the idea of emergency change is something has happened that's negatively impacting the business, and we need to make this change right now. Most commonly, emergency changes will come in the form of applying a patch for known critical vulnerability, or rebooting of a system. You might need to migrate a system. Maybe you're under attack from like a DDoS or something, and you need to migrate the system to a network segment that's not being actively attacked. Those types of things could fall under emergency changes. Emergency changes a lot of times have the same level of documentation, but that documentation is filled out after the fact. So in a normal change, we're going to have all the documentation done before we make the change. In an emergency change, where a lot of times we're going to make the change and then go back and do the documentation. Now, as a CISSP, you're probably not going to be directly involved in all aspects of the change management process, but you do need to be aware of any security implications or impacts that could arise as a result of that change. So a lot of times if we're looking at like a RASCE chart, or responsible, accountable, consult, inform, if you will, you're going to be in that consult and inform bucket more so than a responsible. And then lastly, when it comes to change management, there is an organization out there called ITIL, ITIL, or Information Technology Information Library, I believe is the acronym. Pardon me, it's been a long day, lots of acronyms. But the point is ITIL has some very cleanly and clearly defined processes and guidelines around how to do change management. So if you don't know how to do change management, or that's a new concept to you, I do encourage you to check out ITIL. So going from change and into kind of recovery strategies. So if your change doesn't work out well, you might need some recovery strategies. So we're going to talk about some of this. Now, a fair amount of what we're going to cover tonight is going to seem familiar. It's topics or things we've covered in previous chapters, but we're now going to cover them in a new context. Especially in the software side. So when we get into domain 8, there'll be a lot of rehashing of old ideas, but for new application. So here we're going to go through what is RTO, and we've covered this again. Thank you. Information Technology Infrastructure Library is ITIL. Recovery time objective, or RTO. So this is the amount of time after we've experienced an incident or disaster before the system could be expected to be recovered using our contingency procedures. So we're trying to get back up on our feet. It's the amount of time that we can be down for before we need to be back up and running, at least in a minimum system capacity. Then we have our recovery point objective, or how much data loss is tolerable to us. So no matter what we do, unless we are in a hot, always on, high availability, real-time replicated environment, chances are if we have a interruption or disaster incident, we're going to lose some amount of data. So depending on what system we're doing or how sensitive that system is, we could have more or less here. Some organizations do it by number of transactions or data points. Most organizations do it as an amount of time, expressed as time on a clock. So, no more than a day of data, or no more than 5 hours of data, whatever that recovery point objective is. And then we get into the maximum tolerable or allowable downtime, MTD or MAD. And as you've come to learn, we love our acronyms, and we love to have multiple acronyms to describe exactly the same thing. Makes it fun for all of us. So maximum tolerable or allowable downtime is the amount of time the organization can survive without the asset, without the system or the data or the process. After we've exceeded the MTD or MAD, we are in a situation where the organization may no longer be viable, where it's actually at risk of going out of business due to a variety of factors. So what we want to make sure here is that we are always aware of these metrics as we're deciding what our recovery strategies will be, as we're building out things like disaster recovery plans and incident response plans. We always want to be aware of what the RTO, RPO, and MTD is for any given process or system. We need to make sure that the RTO is always less than the MTD. Otherwise, it is not going to be useful to us. So we could, we don't want to be in a situation where the RTO is 2 days past the MTD. That just doesn't make any sense. So talking about backups, as we're thinking about those backups and how often we're going to make them, we also need to think about what type of backup we're going to need to make. There are different types of backups, and depending on the one we choose, there are benefits and there are negatives, right? So there's positives and negatives to any choice. A full backup is exactly like it sounds. It is a complete backup of all data or all of the system in its entirety. It's going to take the longest amount of time to run. It's going to take the longest amount of time to restore, and it's going to consume the most amount of space. A full backup is good. You do at least want to have one of them laying around. I like to make a full backup, at least depending on the system, on a weekly basis or a monthly basis. But you want to make sure you have at least one full backup somewhere. Now, a differential backup is going to be all the data that's changed since the last full backup. So if I do a full backup on Sunday and then Monday through Saturday, I do differentials, I'm going to be able to run those backups more quickly because I'm only capturing that day's data. It's going to, obviously be less storage then. One of the things to understand is that if you're doing differentials, you will have to restore the full backup first and then the subsequent differentials. Same thing with incrementals. Incrementals are going to be all the data that has changed since the last full or incremental backup. They are the fastest backup type, and they're going to be the smallest in data. But again, if I'm in a recovery or restoration mode, I'm going to have to restore the full backup first, and then any incremental backup that's been made since, while differentials are only going to be the last full and the last differential. These are factors that we need to consider when we're looking at that RTO RPO. So if we're trying to fall within a specific time frame, we need to be very aware of, does our backup strategy for that system support that recovery time? It would be terrible if we had gone with a backup strategy of full backups only, and we're making them every day or whatever, and a full backup takes us longer to restore than the RTO allows for or the MTD allows for. So something to be very aware of. You're always going to have to balance the cost and speed of recovery and speed of restoration. So as you're thinking about what backup solutions to select, which strategies to go with, make sure you're always doing that cost benefit analysis. And again, cost isn't just financial cost. Cost is time, effort, talent, skills. You might need outside third parties that delay things. It could be any number of things. So make sure cost, when you're thinking about it, is not just financial, but is really the total cost of the activity. The other thing you're going to want to consider is the length of data retention. I would argue all of us are storing way more data than we really need, but there are legal requirements to storing data for a specific time period. For example, financial data has to be stored, I believe, for 7 years. So it's making sure that we fall within those retention requirements as well, and that we've thought about those retention requirements as part of our backup strategies. Now, a very common backup strategy that is done for resiliency and recoverability is the 3-2-1 backup strategy. So this is that you're saying that you have at least 3 complete copies of the data in its entirety, 2 of them stored locally or on site within your environment. This could, be in different geo regions or whatever, and that the main copy of the data, at least one of those copies is stored off-site. The idea being, if you get attacked and the ransomware is deployed on your backups or your backups get corrupt, that you have a off-site location that has a known good secure backup at it that you could restore from. Or if you experience a natural disaster, a physical disaster, right? Hurricanes still happen, tornadoes still happen. So if the facility happens to be, negatively impacted in any way from any type of disaster, that you have a good copy of the backup stored off-site, making it so that you can meet your RTO, RPO, and MTD requirements. The other thing we need to think about are the integrity and confidentiality of the backups. All too often, I find backups that do not have the same level of security controls applied that the system that backup was made from has applied. We want to be consistent across the board. So whatever security controls are on the system that we're backing up, those same controls should be in place for the backup. We need to make sure that the backup itself is in a known good state. The backup can successfully complete and be corrupt. It can have errors. If there's been any pollution of the data, you could have a situation where the integrity of the backup, either from the data itself or the actual backup file, is not to the level you need it to be to respect the integrity of the CIA or even be able to restore. So we need to make sure that integrity of that data is first and top of mind as we're doing this. Now, some systems do have automated integrity checks built in. It is, if you can do that, definitely do that. There's manual ways to check that integrity, like testing the backup by restoring it. And it's always advisable to do that. Even if you use an automated integrity check, it's still a good practice to actually restore the backup and make sure that it does what you think it's going to do and it works as designed. So those test restorations are great. You can also work a test restoration into part of a incident response plan exercise and disaster recovery plan exercise. So there's ways to do this that you accomplish multiple goals at once. But bottom line is make sure that you've backed the system up, make sure that the security controls are in place. If you've got a highly restrictive system with multi-factor and very limited access, least privilege, all these things, you need to make sure that same amount of rigor of those security controls is applied to the backup media itself. You might need to do additional controls on above and beyond. So depending on how you're storing that data, for example, if you're using an Amazon S3 bucket to store your backups, you may need to do additional security control work around the S3 bucket itself and make sure that you have the appropriate security controls in place, the appropriate auditing and logging controls in place. You may need to have different access requirements on the backup media itself. You may be working with a third party who is handling that backup media. You may have individuals that are on the DR team that will need to work with that media in a disaster scenario, but normally would never have access to it. So making sure those access requirements are established and enforced. You want to make sure that the media itself and the data on there can be tracked as part of your asset inventory. So going back to domain 1, right? And if not, it should be assets and inventories and tracking. You want to make sure that you're doing this in the full context of a risk assessment and you've addressed. Quick example, make sure to label the backup media. I have gone into organizations before where they said we have all the backups and they're securely stored and all of the disk were just disks. I couldn't tell you which one had what data on it. I couldn't tell you when that backup had been created, whether it was a full or a differential. And in a crisis, in a disaster recovery scenario, speed is key. So making sure things are properly labeled, tracked, and managed is going to make everything that much easier. One of the ways that we deal with redundancy and making sure that we have recoverability is by using RAID, or redundant array of inexpensive disk. This allows us to use multiple hard drives organized in a logical way that they act and behave as a larger drive. For those of you old enough, you'll remember that there didn't used to be terabyte hard drives or gigabyte hard drives. They just didn't exist. And so if you wanted a gigabyte hard drive, you had to build it out of lots of little 500 megabyte hard drives. And the way you would do that and get it to work as a single unit was by using RAID. So it allows you to use cheaper disk to build larger disk volume. It also gives you increased read-write speeds and data fault tolerance. And that's the part we're going to dial in on a little bit more here, is the fault tolerance aspect. Now, the way that these drives are managed is through what's called a RAID controller. A RAID controller is handling the input-output operations on the disk itself. It's routing specific data to specific disks depending on the RAID configuration. And we'll talk more about RAID configurations in the next slide. But the two main ways that we do this is through striping. And so striping is going to be writing the data in smaller chunks across multiple drives. This is going to give us the benefit of an increased read-write speed. So a little bit of data here, a little bit of data there, a little bit of data there. Mirroring is going to be making complete copies of the data. So striping is bits of data spread across multiple drives, creating one big piece of data, where mirroring is truly full copy of the data. Now, mirroring can come in handy for a variety of things. When a stripe fails, you can have issues with data parity and need to reconstruct that data, and that again will affect that how quickly you can recover. When you can lose some stripes, but you can't lose too many of them. Where mirroring is that full copy, it's that full backup. And, really best practice is a little bit of both. So let's talk about that. So RAID 0 is a stripe disk array. It has no fault tolerance at all. What it is going to give you is bigger disk with faster read-write performance, because you're only putting a little bit of data on each disk, but there's no fault tolerance. RAID 1 is going to be that mirrored disk. It's going to give you great fault tolerance, but no benefit to read and write performance, because I'm writing 2 complete copies to 2 separate disks, or as many disks as I have mirrors for. RAID 5 is going to be striping with a parity array. So this is going to give us both fault tolerance as well as an increase in read and write performance. That parity array is what allows me to know which stripes the data resides on. So if I have a specific drive failure, one of my stripes dies, I can go find the corresponding stripe that has the data that was also on that particular stripe. So it's a way for me to reassemble the data should I have a failure. RAID 0+1 and 1+0 are nested RAIDs. So this is both functions of 0 and 1 in different orders. So 0+1 is a striped array of mirrors, and 1+0 is a mirrored array of stripes. Both of those is going to give us a fault tolerant disk array, but also a performance benefit. Now, these are going to be the most expensive out of the options. So again, we have to weigh that cost. We have to say, okay, is the fault tolerance increase worth it or not? And, if you're talking about like NASs and SANs and things like this, they also use RAID, and then they have additional layers above that. If you are doing striping, make sure you know which stripe belongs where. If you're hot swapping drives in a stripe configuration and you get your order wrong, you could have some issues. Looks like James brought that point up in the chat. Cloud, oh gosh, the cloud. Little Linux servers that cry tears of data. So cloud is really where everybody's going with all this stuff anyways. So we've got a few different options in the cloud. We have those full software as a service offerings. So this is going to give us that high availability, that automatic data replication, data durability, multiple geo regions. The idea is it's the proactive management of the data, and we're preserving that integrity and availability. So we can have lots of resource power. We can spread the data across the globe, lots of copies. And generally is going to be all done through a software as a service type platform. However, you can use the cloud solely for raw storage of backup files that you manually make yourself and move out to the cloud. A lot of organizations are doing this because it's highly available. It's a low cost option a lot of times. And so it's just like a Dropbox, right? You just move a file out there. It's like old school FTP, but hopefully more secure. You also have storage options like infrastructure as a service. So you can actually stand up replicate infrastructure in the cloud that is acting as a backup. Maybe you have a SQL server that you're replicating data to, and that's how you're handling your redundancy. Or you could have platform as a service options as well, where you're just using a cloud hosted SQL server that has replicates. A lot of times, platform as a service is going to be used to create environments that are similar to your environment. Database, very easy to hot swap databases if you are using a platform as a service offering. Now, you do lose physical control, and that's something you have to weigh. You will not have the physical control over the data, and that does present a risk. And that risk has to be weighed against any perceived cost savings. And again, whether it's financial or other non-financial costs, that's something you need to take into consideration. That is very much the role of a CISSP and a security practitioner, is helping to make these decisions. Now, you don't make this decision, you help inform this decision. You help navigate the risk math. Recovery site strategies. So this is if all heck is broken loose and I now have to pick a backup site. This could be done in anticipation of a disaster. This could be part of my infrastructure build out. But what I need to have is some kind of recovery site. And we've talked about this previous. We'll go into some more detail in a minute about the types of recovery sites you can have. But every type of recovery site will come with some type of trade-off. Generally, that trade-off is going to be speed of access and effective use of the site against the cost of maintaining the site. We need to think about things like picking locations that are accessible within our RTO, RPO windows. Let's say we have a system that has an RTO of 3 hours, but the secondary site is 5 hours away. Well, that's going to be a problem. So we need to think about these things. We need to think about travel time. If we're in a true disaster and someone is in a vehicle going to another geographic location, we need to account for that travel time as part of our recovery strategy and as part of the planning that we're doing. And these are things that are often overlooked. We don't think about that stuff as much. So we want to make sure that we're looking at these, and whatever our RTO and MTD windows are, that we understand whether we can hit those, because maybe we have to go further to the site because the one closest to us costs 3 times the amount. Well, then maybe we have to sit down with the business and say, in order to meet the RTO MTD, we need to spend 3 times the amount. The business might choose to make a risk decision and say, you know what, we can actually go a few hours longer than we thought we could because we don't want to pay 3 times the expense. So the biggest factor in recovery site strategies is the temperature scale, if you will. We refer to these as cold sites, warm sites, and hot sites. It's a way of describing how available the site is to us in our moment of need. So for example, a cold site generally is going to be an empty facility. It'll probably have some power drops. It'll probably have some server racks, but it won't be active. The servers aren't turned on. They're not up to date. They don't have the latest data replicate. Maybe there's other things that need to be set up and configured. Cold sites are going to be your lowest cost option. They're also going to take the longest amount of time to stand up. Warm sites are going to be kind of in between cold and hot, just like the word warm would let us believe. The idea there is that I have some equipment. Maybe some of it's even on, maybe some of it's partially configured, but I still have to do some build out with it before I'm in a full state of being able to use it. Warm sites are kind of that in between. Again, cold's going to take me forever. I don't have forever, but I can't afford to have a truly duplicate site, or what we would call a hot site. A hot site is a one-to-one. It got the exact same infrastructure as the primary site, and it's going to be costly. You're going to be paying double the infrastructure. If you're investing in a hot site, most folks also then invest in real-time replication between the sites, so that in the event of a failover, it's really a non-event. If you have a hot site, you're probably doing real-time replication, and if you have a failure at your primary site, switching over a lot of times is just a matter of a DNS change, or even if you've accounted for it, your high availability solution might just automatically cut over for you. Now, mobile sites are generally semi-truck trailers that can show up anywhere. If I need a sudden data center, let's say a good example is when we have hurricanes. So a hurricane shows up, it wipes out the local infrastructure, and we need to get telco services back up, or we need to get processing services to help people get the recovery items they need, water, food, et cetera, whatever. A lot of times a mobile site will be brought in. Mobile site it's like a hot site on wheels. Again, very expensive, but if you need them, you can get them. Cloud bursting. Cloud bursting is again, it's using that cloud service in place of a disaster. Now there is a question in the chat about ransomware. So ransomware, you always need to be thinking about that and any other security vulnerability when you're doing your site selection. So if you are doing something like a real-time replication, how are you validating that you're not moving security issues between your two sites? So that should be part of your risk assessment process. That should be part of your contingency and business continuity process. You know, ideally, before you've gotten to site selection, you should have accounted for how am I going to deal with security risks and vulnerabilities that might arise in sending things back and forth between these facilities. Multiple processing sites. So the larger organizations generally will have multiple hot sites distributed across. The big banks do this. You know, Capital One is a good example. They have a ton of different places that they have infrastructure stood up. So in the event of a specific geographic disaster, they can reroute traffic to a location that is not impacted. It is generally unlikely that you will have a disaster significant enough to cause loss and outage affecting multiple geographic regions at once. And as somebody that I was mentoring under many years ago told me, when I said, but what happens if that happens? They said, Ryan, we've got bigger problems on our hands at that point. You're talking about, you know, a significant enough disaster that really this business and its computers are the least concern of everyone. So for example, if the city of Chicago disappears, you got bigger problems on your hands. So, you know, keep that in context when you're thinking about how far to take this and how many geo-redundant locations you might need. Generally, the redundancy is built in, right? The idea if you're going to do this multiple processing site is, again, things are highly available. There's a lot of near real-time replication going on. The biggest issue with multiple sites is replication and synchronization. How am I keeping data in motion? If I'm truly using multiple site processing, I could have customer A transacting on a system in California and customer B transacting on a system in New York, and those transactions can affect each other. So I need to make sure those things are staying in synchronization. And like with any technology, I could have a failure of my replication or synchronization processes. So I need to account for that as part of my continuity strategy. I need to account for that as part of my disaster recovery planning. And if I'm leveraging any kind of outside provider, and we'll say this 100 times before the night is over, any outsourced service provider providing any outsourced service increases the risk to you because you lose control over the data or the infrastructure. Now, that increased risk might be offset by substantial cost savings or performance improvements, but we want to keep that in mind when we're making these decisions and selections. So resilience, let's talk about this. I've used the term high availability a lot tonight, so let's make sure that we cover what that is. So resilience is exactly that. It's the ability of a system or process to be resistant to failure. That it can take self-correcting actions, that it can figure out if it has a stuck or hung process, that it's able to a certain degree, self-heal. Resilience is key, and you want to think about that, right? Fault tolerance is another way of describing resilience. You know, it's fault tolerance is a little bit more narrow, but they're very similar. High availability means that you have a highly available system. So you're using technologies like load balancers and clusters, and you have different redundancies and dynamic routing and things like that, so that if any one component within the ecosystem fails, the system can automatically reroute things to that next most available component. Very good stuff to have, also very expensive. The more highly available the system is, generally, the more expensive the system is. You have quality of service controls. So the QoS, right? Generally, this is done in a networking layer, and it's going to prioritize the traffic that is deemed to be most important first. So if you get into a limited bandwidth situation, let's say your standard system has a gigabit connection, and now you're in some type of recovery mode at a secondary site, and you only have a 500 megabit connection. Which traffic is more important than other traffic? QoS is going to help make sure that that most important traffic gets processed first in a situation of limited bandwidth. And then fault tolerant is again, it's able to handle a fault. It's able to deal with a failure. Fault tolerant systems are resilient systems. So it's that I know what to do when, I can handle it. A good example, if any of you have ever been in a data center and looked at the back of a server rack and saw there's multiple NIC cards, multiple network interface cards. The idea there was one of those could die. Something bad could happen to it, it'd go up in a puff of smoke. Well, if that happens, I could still have network connectivity because I have a second NIC card. Now, for those of us that were like, hey, this is an opportunity to do some pairing and increase our bandwidth, that was an added benefit. But the reason that card was in that was actually for redundancy purposes, not us getting more throughput through the network. So we're going to talk a little bit about disaster recovery and disaster recovery processes. Going to intro you to some terms that might be new for you. The first term is the BIA, or the Business Impact Analysis. This is that lovely document that we go through and ask the business, what happens if and when? What is important? So in a business impact analysis, what you're trying to understand are what are the systems, processes, technologies, humans, roles and functions that impact the business. What computer is processing purchase orders, and that probably has a higher impact to the business if something was to happen to it than the computer that tracks the birthday calendar, right? So we want to go through this impact analysis to understand what are the critical business functions and operations. Now, the business impact analysis is what's going to inform our business continuity plan. It's what's going to inform our disaster recovery plan. It's what's going to inform our incident response plan to a certain degree. So we want to be very clear on what the impact is of those systems to the business. And a lot of times our RTO, RPO is found in this BIA process. Then after we've done the BIA, we move on to continuity. What are we going to do if and when that system is not available? We could maybe have redundancies, or maybe we have manual paper processes. I worked for a business years ago that provided fast food restaurants with cash register systems. And one of the continuity of operations was to take orders on pen and paper. So if anything ever happened to the cash register system, if anything ever happened to the power being provided to the computers, as long as the grill was still running, as long as the fryer was running, then they could do business. And we would do that business on pen and paper. So that continuity, how am I keeping the business running while navigating the disaster, while navigating recovery operations or incident response type operations? DR, that's disaster recovery, and it's a subset of business continuity. And it's going to focus on restoring the IT services and functions when a disaster occurs. So the business continuity is happening while the DR is being implemented. And the business continuity continues throughout the life cycle of the disaster recovery. At the end of disaster recovery, when you're fully recovered, is when the business goes from continuity of operations back to restoration of normal operations. And of course, welcome to acronym hell. We like to put it all together. So we have the BCDR. Somebody just wanted to, I don't know, mash letters together, I guess. So we have the BCDR, which is just the BC and the DR. These are all related things. So you'll hear that sometimes somebody will refer to the BCDR, whether it's a standalone BC with a DR component or whether it's all one monolithic document, doesn't really matter, but you do need both sides. You do need that continuity of operations plan as well as the recovery plan. You have to have your RTOs and RPOs defined. All of this is predicated on the idea that I did a business impact analysis and I know what I'm working with from an outage perspective. How long can I be without these services? How long do I need to get things back up and running? That information actually predicates the majority of the risk decisions you're going to make. How close of a location do I need? Does it have to be highly available? How redundant is the disk array? Which cloud providers, which geo regions? All of these things should be driven from the outputs of the business impact analysis. Response. So number one, and we've said this a lot, and we'll say it even a few more times before the night is through. Number one, health, life, safety. Human life trumps everything, end of story. It's always the number one. That must be addressed first. All your planning should be around that first. Number one, okay? Cannot stress that enough. Then once we've addressed that and people are safe, they're out of the building, we start doing a coordinated response. How are we going to do this? Who's on first? What's on second? What is the direction and oversight within this disaster type, right? So crisis coordinator. So making sure we have a coordinated response is key. This is what keeps chaos to a minimum. And if you've ever lived through a disaster recovery scenario or a disaster scenario where you didn't have a business continuity plan, you didn't have a business impact analysis, like a lot of stuff was missing, it's chaos, and chaos leads to mistakes, making things worse, increasing spend. So it can get really expensive. So make sure you have that coordinated response. You want to be clear and consistent in your communications, whether those are internal communications, whether those are external communications, leadership, technical folks, public, media, law enforcement, et cetera, et cetera. The better you manage communication, the more clear, crisp, concise, and consistent it is, the less open-ended threads. Evan likes to say, and I agree with him, gaps get filled. So if you leave a gap, you didn't have a communication to address something, somebody's just going to make something up and say that's what's happening. So make sure you've dealt with that and you have as much as possible communications planned in advance. And then you need to document everything. So as you go through the disaster, you want to be documenting findings. This is unfortunately where most organizations learn that their plans that they did not test aren't as good as they thought they were going to be. And so if you haven't pre-planned for this, if you haven't done some tabletop exercises and you're living a real world test of your disaster recovery plan, the better you document, the better you'll be able to fix that plan on the backside. So make sure you're doing that. There's also insurance reasons that you need to document. There could be legal reasons that you need to document, especially if you're in a disaster recovery scenario in a regulated industry. Maybe you're in the gas and oil industry or healthcare, or hospital or something like that. So there could be a lot of reasons to document. Make sure that you do it. Very important. There are considerations for personnel. So there can be novel risks to personnel. In a disaster scenario, a lot of times we're looking for all the help we can get, all hands on deck. Have you ever opened a Word doc? Excellent. You can help us stand up a virtual server. Well, yes and no. So make sure that you understand that new personnel doing things with equipment or installing equipment in environments that they're unfamiliar with or systems and equipment that they're unfamiliar with can present additional risks to that, to the disaster, but also to the personnel themselves. So make sure you've thought of these things. You need to account for risks in your business continuity and disaster recovery plans. You need to narrow that down as much as possible and ensure that you have addressed the risk in a way that allows you to measure it and minimize it. Business continuity and disaster recovery plans need to have roles and responsibilities clearly defined. As much as possible, a named human associated, but if you don't have that level of detail, that's fine. But make sure that the database restoration person knows that that's their role and knows what they're responsible for doing, up to and including who they're working with, what communications they might need to be involved in, etc. If you can, please do have named personnel and contact details. Document this stuff. There's too many times in my career where the plan wasn't printed out or they didn't know who to call. They had one cell phone number and no other phone numbers. So the better you have these things documented in advance, the better you are prepared to communicate in crisis mode. And the faster you're going to handle this, the cheaper it's going to be. Clear assignment of duties is very important. You also don't want to be in the middle of a disaster and somebody's like, that's not mine to do. You want to make sure that you're very clear about who's doing what. Having practices in place like job rotation and cross training can prevent that issue of that new person getting a task because you're in crisis mode that you normally would have not given them. So the more you can do job rotation, the more you can do cross training, the better prepared you're going to be. Also, in a disaster scenario, if you have a single person who is responsible for something and they are unable to do it, because they're out on leave or something like that, you could be left with a gap. Feed your people. I'm going to speed up a little bit. We're cooking along. We still got a ton of content, so I'm going to crank on the gas pedal here. Make sure to feed people. Think about things like housing. If you're going off site, you might need to, if you're relocating to another area further away, you might need to make accommodations for their family, daycare, all kinds of things. Make sure you've accounted for the fact people are going to be stressed out and tired. Give them some breaks, some diversions. And that you've accounted for these costs. A lot of those costs can be covered by your insurance. Crisis communications are going to be difficult. Again, it's a dynamic environment when you're dealing with disasters. Make sure that things are documented, that it's baked into the training, and that you only have one person doing the talking. I encourage you guys to go through these slides in more detail later. Internal stakeholders. So employees and management, right? We're going to have to talk amongst ourselves. We're going to have to communicate. Generally, it's going to be about the specific thing we're dealing with. So make sure we have these communications predefined. Also, we may need to communicate off channel. If we are in the middle of dealing with a cyber attack, and we think the bad guys are in our network, using the system email to talk to each other could be showing our hand. So we might need to use cell phone number. We might need to, maybe you've got an old rotary phone you can fire up and call somebody on a landline, figure that out, but be prepared that you have to communicate internally. You also have to communicate externally, forensic responders, law enforcement, insurance companies, the general public. Depending on the state you live in, it could be the attorney general. So make sure that you have communications accounted for in your disaster recovery plan, and as much as possible, pre-canned communications. You don't want to figure this stuff out on the fly. So we need to do some assessments in order to be able to prepare for these risks. So we're going to do a disaster recovery assessment. It's similar to a risk assessment, but now we're looking at the specific goal of trying to understand the impact of the disaster and what steps we need to take to address it. So this is getting down to the specific type of nature and source of disaster. Is it a security event? Is it a tornado, a hurricane? Do you live in Minnesota and the plow truck slid off the road and drove through the side of the building, right? What's going on? How you deal with it's going to be different. Most incidents are very dynamic in nature, so you need to think about that as well. Disasters tend not to stay static. And yes, you can have multiple disasters at once. You can be in the middle of a ransomware attack and get hit with an earthquake. I hope that never happens to you, but it can happen. So you need to make sure you've accounted for these things. So if you live in an earthquake zone, make sure you have a plan for dealing with an earthquake. You may need to pair that plan in with dealing with a cyber incident as well. Again, health, life, safety, number one. And then post-recovery, make sure that you're going back after the fact and doing a impact analysis on the disaster. What worked well, what didn't, and how much did things cost? Once we're through that, now we're to restoration. Okay, the goal of restoration is to get back on our feet as fast as possible. Some terms that you want to be familiar with are primary site, secondary site. This is to keep confusion about where things are and what is the area we need to pay attention to. So for example, if you moved physical facilities, the new facility becomes the primary site. Well, when you're done with the disaster, you're going to move back to your old facility, which now becomes the primary site. So using that term can help confusion between which one of the physical locations you are. The goal of recovery is getting back to the critical business functions as fast as possible. You're recovering, you're not restoring. So you're going to be in a diminished capacity a lot of times. It's going to be the least amount possible to get the business back up and running. the goal of restoration is to get you back to that normal state of operations. So know the difference between those two. There are things that you're going to need to inform stakeholders of. The security team a lot of times doesn't have specific actions to do during this time period, but are absolutely critical stakeholders and need to be involved along the conversation. For example, moving data. Moving data between facilities could have security considerations and components. And if I didn't have a highly available system and I don't have replicates and I'm now loading a bunch of hard drives into the back of Jerry's pickup as he's ripping down a dirt road, there might be some security concerns I need to address there. Training and awareness, as always with all things, the more we know, the safer we can be. Everyone should understand health, life, and safety plans. Again, I told you I was going to beat that drum a lot because it's so important and often overlooked. Make sure personnel understand how to respond, that they've been trained on the response. The more you practice your plans, the more you train on your plans, the smoother it all goes and the faster you actually get back to normal operations. Also gives you a chance to identify any gaps or weakness in the plan. And there are specific trainings needed for specific duties. Make sure that those folks are getting those training opportunities. You want to focus on continuous improvement. So formal reviews after you've restored. What worked well? What didn't work well? What do we need to do? What actions contributed to, hindered the recovery? So somebody having a really bad attitude, not playing well with their coworker, could slow down recovery. On the same side, somebody having a really great attitude and being the team cheerleader could make things move faster. So make sure you account for that. When you do a review after the fact, a couple terms we use: post-mortem, we borrow that from the medical world; after action report, we borrow that from the military; retrospective, I'm not sure where that comes from, I think it's academia; and lessons learned, also I think academia. But either way, there are different ways to describe the exact same thing, and that's taking a step back and going, what worked well, what didn't work well, what will we do better next time, and how do we update our plans to ensure we've accounted for what we've learned. And then root cause analysis, what actually caused this in the first place? A lot of times root cause analysis doesn't happen because it is deemed to be not worth the cost. However, sometimes you have to actually figure out what happened so you can make sure it doesn't happen again. Test, test, test. That's all I'm going to say on this slide. Please test your plans. My gosh, test them. And when you're testing them, start them simple. Do some tabletop stuff. Do some lightweight things. If folks don't know how to do these things, asking them to do them at the snap of a finger isn't probably the best way. So give folks time to build knowledge. That can be done through testing. If it's not a cumbersome or burdensome test, try to test it more frequently, and make sure to print your plans. Please print your plans and store them multiple places. Don't be those folks, please, where we come in and, hey, we're here to help. And you're like, where's the plan? You're like, it's on the server that's been ransomwared, or it was in the bottom drawer of the filing cabinet in the room that flooded, right? Think about these things. Make sure you have multiple forms of it. Also understand there are security impacts to those plans. If those plans have specific IP addresses, specific accounts, contact details for staff, you need to protect those plans as well. Those plans are not necessarily public. So make sure the appropriate security controls are in place for wherever you store them. All right, tabletops. This is my fun one. Tabletops, small group exercise. We get together, we whip out the plan, you bring in somebody like myself, and I go, so I just wiped out the data center. What do you do? The CEO's admin's laptop just died. What do you do, right? So we give you paper-based hypotheticals to work through the plan on paper. We're not doing any actual testing of anything. It's literally role-playing, kind of Dungeons and Dragons style, if you will, although I've never seen it played with dice, but that would be a lot of fun. The idea of doing a tabletop is to find any gaps in the plan. Anything that we've overlooked, any outdated information. A plan that hasn't been updated is a plan that's not going to work. So make sure we're updating those things. It's also the lowest cost method and generally will satisfy auditors and insurance folks who are like, hey, tell me you've tested your plan. Yeah, we tested it. We did a tabletop. Now, tabletops are great, but tabletops are not going to give you the full picture. So the next level up is called a walkthrough. Walkthrough is actually going to simulate responding. So for example, if I need to go to a secondary site, I'm actually going to get in my car and drive there. I'm going to simulate that because I assume it takes me an hour to get there. But turns out there's construction on the 405 and it now takes me 3 hours to get there. Well, oops, our plan isn't very good. Our RTO RPO says I got to have it back in an hour. Now what do I do? So a walkthrough is a physical simulation. You're mimicking. I'm pretending I'm plugging in the thumb drive. I'm pretending I'm fixing the database. But I'm actually going into the data center to do it. I'm actually driving to another location. I'm actually doing some physical action. And generally this is done to, again, discover any gaps, missing details, and it's challenging the assumptions we've made. So again, if I think the facility's right around the corner, but I've never actually drove there, I might be making assumptions that don't hold up in reality. Then there's the simulation. The simulation is truly a full-blown simulation. This is actually recalling data, restoring data, failing over to secondary sites, moving staff to other sites in larger volumes. This really is that full-blown test. In the old days, before they invented software that does this for you, we would do, Chaos Monkey. If you've ever heard of Chaos Monkey, guys like myself would go in a data center and yank a few cables, see what happened. There's your simulation. Said it was highly available, said it was resilient. Let me pull a random network cable and see how resilient you are. And now we actually have software that does that. We'll talk more about that later on. But the idea is that this is as close to the real deal as you're going to get. And then lastly, you have parallel. So parallel are going to be done with the alternate working. So I'm simulating, but I'm simulating it while leaving the production system alone. I'm making sure that I can do this and that and this is done to mitigate and minimize any operational impacts. In a true simulation, I have downtime. In a true simulation, it's not going to go right. It's going to have problems. I'm going to have to fix them. Parallel, while those problems are happening, my productive environment is still up and running just fine. So make sure you do some kind of testing. And then lastly, full interruption. This is the scariest of all the tests. Very few people do this test. There are generally, if this test is done, it is done on a narrow subset of systems because it is insanely disruptive and insanely expensive. And it never goes well. It is an important thing to do for certain systems, but this is full blown real world bad news bears. So business continuity. So you have to help out with business continuity. There was a question in the chat earlier about when does it go from a business continuity to disaster recovery? Well, this meeting is the meeting you help shape that conversation. You do not a lot of times have direct responsibility for the activities, but you need to be there with your security lens on, helping stakeholders understand risks, helping risk decisions to be clearly understood and the impacts of those decisions understood. You are not there to make those decisions. That is the business's job. You're there to help support the business in making good judgment calls about what will and won't work, and then actually participating in the exercises as well. There could be security components that you need to enforce. There could be issues that come up during the testing that you need to address. So make sure you are an active participant in those planning and testing exercises. All right, take a quick swig of the liquid fuel here, and we're going to talk physical security. In my opinion, one of the funnest parts of doing security work. So at the end of the day, all computing systems ultimately do live physically somewhere, whether that's a data center that you don't know the address of and hosted by Microsoft or Google or Amazon, whether that's your office, your secondary location, whatever that might be. At the end of the day, all computing happens on a physical machine somewhere that lives at a physical facility. So physical security is an important part of being a CISSP. A lot of times you're not going to be responsible for it. You're going to work with somebody else that's a physical security expert, but you need to understand that that physical security component is critical to the security controls that you're proposing, recommending, and ultimately enforcing. So a quick visual, if we think of layers, just like we do with security, right? It's all about the layers. We have our public areas. We have our ingress and egress points, the ins and outs, entrances and exits. We have external facilities. A lot of times the generator, the chemical closet, the if you're using compressed gases, parking facility, these things are part of the site, but are external to the primary building. You have operational facilities. This is generally going to be inside the office itself. Could be, offices, conference rooms, lunchroom, etc. And then within that operational facility, you're going to have other high security facilities. We consider data centers to be a high security facility. You could also have other highly sensitive security facilities. For example, a bank has a vault. That vault is considered the high security facility, or the SCIF, the Secured Compartmentalized Information Facility. In the case of the bank example, it's the Secured Compartmentalized Money Facility, but the idea is the same. There's a space that's so highly secured that that's where I put my most valuable information or my most valuable assets. So know that you have some responsibility for this and being aware of this. Generally, the logical access to the physical facility, which we covered in Chapter 5, identity and access management, is going to be part of your responsibility. Generally, because access control today is done electronically. Not too many people are out there with old school keys and locks. It's usually, an electronic badge, and that's going to live on a computer somewhere on a network segment that you have to secure. Make sure that you're looking at multiple types of security controls when you're doing physical security. So preventative, deterrent, detective, compensating, recovery, directive, and corrective. You can use different physical methods and means, barriers, fences, badges, but also pair that with administrative controls, policies, and procedures. Using a layered model, the longer it takes you to get to my most sensitive resource, the higher the likelihood I'm going to detect you, I'm going to be able to stop you, correct you, etc. And you need to always take that cost into consideration. One of my favorite physical security controls that everybody gets wrong is when I find the hinges on the wrong side of the door. Got this big, fancy, expensive, bulletproof door, but the hinges are on the outside. So that's some things we need to think about. Landscape design. So there's this thing called CPTED, or the Crime Prevention Through Environmental Design methodology. This is where we're using landscaping to provide security through water features and shrubs and trees and things that can control and restrict access without having to put up Jersey barriers and barbed wire fence. Lighting is critical. It is true that well-lit spaces generally don't attract bad guys. Criminals tend not to like brightly lit areas. We need to think about where our windows are and what that window is made of. Maybe you've seen the glass that has the wire mesh inside of it. A lot of times you're going to see that on windows that are indoors themselves or directly adjacent to doors. A locked door doesn't do any good if I can take a brick and smash right through the window next to it. So we need to think about those materials when we're making those selections. We're going to have to look at our perimeter controls. So these are generally our public area stuff. If you're building a new facility, we do this a lot of times with new data centers. We work with the Zoning and Planning Commission to make sure that we're controlling traffic the right way, and somebody can't just take a semi truck at 70 miles an hour through the gate because we've maybe put some speed bumps or a dedicated turn lane that has a really sharp left at the end of it or something like that. A lot of times we can monitor public areas quite easily. They're generally, if you're in public, it's public. You can film it, you can light it, you can do all kinds of things. We need to monitor those public areas for safety, but also any evidence of criminal activity. There are some great new solutions out there in cameras that we'll talk about in a second that have the ability to use AI to detect people and vehicles and animals and alert you when there's an issue. So when we talk about site ingress and egress, or the entrance and exits, guard staff, reception staff, a physical human, keeping an eye on the comings and goings, very helpful. Physical access controls like turnstiles and gates and doors and man traps, bollards and barriers and speed bumps, et cetera, et cetera. Administrative controls a lot of times augment that. So making sure that visitors have to check in and show ID, and maybe they get a different colored ID badge and they have to be escorted. Making sure that you're verifying IT asset purchases. There is a vulnerability right now where bad guys are shipping Wi-Fi pineapples that are on and running to the loading dock, and then it floats around the building for 3 to 5 days before anybody bothers to open it up, and in that time they've compromised the wireless. So having administrative controls that require the verification of those deliveries and things like that. Sensors, temperature sensors, infrared. Maybe you're cool enough and your company's cool enough that you got one of those Mission Impossible laser grids, and the floor will detect a drop of sweat. Most likely not. So a lot of these things will be like a window alarm or a door opening alarm, basic stuff. Think of it as the physical intrusion detection system. Cameras are your friend. Make sure that the cameras themselves are secured. Otherwise that could become a vulnerability. And then guards, humans, dogs work really well as a deterrent control, as well as a detective control. I really like dogs. Dogs are a lot of fun. Make sure to study that in the book. Okay, external facilities. So external is going to be outside of our control or shared control, but we maybe have equipment that doesn't belong to us. Maybe we have a Verizon cell phone tower in the back of the lot. So we want to make sure we've got good security around those external facilities. That, again, health, life, safety. Right. So if anybody can get in and cause trouble to the people in our buildings, then we want to make sure we've addressed that. Things like safety equipment, fire suppression systems, emergency shutoffs. A lot of this stuff is going to be stored external to the facility. Landscaping, again, using the earth as a means of security is always a good one. All right. Operational facilities, internal controls, so fire detection and suppression. This one is very important. Fires damage not only people, but they damage computers as well, which is why it's included. A lot of times I get asked why, and be grateful. We used to have to make you learn the different types of fire extinguishers. That's not a thing anymore, but know that you need them. And know that if you use a water-based sprinkler system in a data center, you'll make a lot of sparks. Also know if you set off a halon in a data center and you're in there when you set it off, well, you're going to have a hard time breathing. So make sure you've got the appropriate controls in place. Access controls, again, the goal here is, are the right people coming and going, and can I prove it and can I control it? Policies and procedures. Is Ted the lockpicking lawyer? If so, send me some locks. But anyways, policies and procedures. So the operational facilities, making sure that we understand clean desks, clean screen. We just did a pen test a while back for a school, and the biggest finding was badges and keys just left publicly accessible. So make sure you're not doing that. Lighting and surveillance, and then building materials. Don't make, the three little pigs, right? Don't make your wall out of tissue paper and think that it's going to hold up in a strong wind. By the same token, you don't need to have 44 feet of solid concrete to protect a cupcake. So make sure that you're picking the right building materials and you understand what that's made of. And again, as a CISSP, you're not really going to make those decisions. You're going to be advising or assessing. High security facilities, so very specific areas. This is where SCIFs come into play, or secure compartmentalized information facilities. That's going to be server rooms, data centers, evidence storage. If you're law enforcement, things like that, you might have evidence storage lockers. Those are going to have a much higher degree. You're going to have additional security controls. They should be burdensome and cumbersome. It should be very hard to get into your most sensitive area, and it should be very loud and very attention drawing if somebody's trying to get in that shouldn't. But you're also going to have increased cost. So if you go the full fancy route and you put in EMF shielding, that's going to be expensive. So if you Faraday cage around a sensitive area. But again, depending on the value of the assets you're trying to protect, it might be worth that cost benefit analysis. So probably getting tired of hearing this, but I cannot say it enough times. Human health and safety, number one, always number one. So make sure that you're thinking about that first and foremost. Some considerations for personnel when they're traveling. There's additional security concerns when traveling. They need to understand that, in certain countries, there are different requirements for getting in and out of the country with electronics, and they might need to take additional measures. They might be in an area that has a high degree of civil unrest, and they need to take additional physical security measures to protect themselves and the equipment that they've brought with them. If your CEO, your CFO, and your CIO are all in the same airplane, that might present a risk. So, learn more about this, make sure to read the book, but this is basically, know that there's a travel component. Same thing with training and awareness. We need to have awareness. Awareness is great. I think all of us are aware of a lot of things. I like to try to move from aware to care, but that's a different talk for another day. But make sure you're doing it. Training is going to be specific knowledge being, conveyed. Generally, it's going to be in the form of a specific job function, a specific task. Education is going to be more generalized in form. Education is what you're getting here tonight. And then effectiveness. It's not worth doing any of this stuff if you can't measure whether it worked or not. And the only way you're going to know if your programs are effective is to measure them. So make sure you're doing that. In an emergency management scenario, you might have other security considerations and coordinate with responders. You might have to work with the fire department, the emergency responders, law enforcement, etc. So make sure that your folks understand that that's a thing and that we've trained on how that's going to work. Same thing with communications. Emergency communications might need alternate means. Emergency communication, if your PA system goes down, could be a bullhorn, right? But we need to think about that. We need to plan for that. And again, this is all back to that business continuity disaster recovery, which, if you remember, starts with a business impact analysis. And if you haven't done a BIA, you're not ready to do a BCP or a DRP. And then the actual execution. So executing the plan of the DR or the BCP, is make sure you have easy to understand instructions. It shouldn't just be a bunch of technical gobbledygook. If it sounds like a robot wrote it, probably going to be very difficult to follow. So make sure you're doing that. And again, you probably aren't the one writing the message, but you probably have input to add to it. Duress. So duress is an important topic. Duress is whenever somebody is being forced to do something. And we see this more and more every day, where blackmailing, folks being held hostage. These are extreme examples, but it does and can happen. Anybody that gets sweaty when you get the email that says, I've got a video of you doing something to yourself on the internet, and I'm going to send it to your spouse and your church and these other people. If you get sweaty, maybe make different life choices, but that scenario is called duress. So that's somebody under duress, or there's someone's attempting to get them to do something they wouldn't normally do. Make sure, again, health, safety, life should always be in place, but you want to have some kind of security control. And this is especially important for your C-level folks. They're most likely to experience duress. So you should have some kind of subtle means of indicating it. Could be a special code, could be an electronic lock. I know if you ever see a lady do this, tucks the thumb and goes like this, that is a sign for duress, that she's in a domestic violence situation and needs help. It's one of the ways that they can non-verbally communicate. So if you're ever seeing anything like that, that's what that means. That is a subtle mean of indicating duress. In your work setting, it could be a phrase. The example they use is, by the way, my Aunt Sylvia says hi. Sounds normal, but I'm pretty sure you don't have an Aunt Sylvia, and also very sure I'm not talking to her. So now I know that that means something's not right. I know that we've pre-agreed that that phrase indicates that it's duress, but that should not be recognizable by an outsider. Oh my gosh, so much to get through tonight. All right, how about a dad joke before we get into the next section? The police just pulled me over and the officer came up to my window and said, "Papers?" I said, "Scissors." I win, and then I drove off. They've been chasing me for 45 minutes. Now I think they want a rematch. Oh, domain 8. Software development. I don't think I actually updated this slide, so ignore it. All right, there we go. Software development. So welcome to the SDLC, or Software Development Life Cycle. This is a passion area of mine. My background is in software development. That is where I cut my teeth on a lot of tech and kind of got my first intro to security. So this is will be fun for me. There are 6 phases to the SDLC. As with all things, planning, analysis, design, and then implementing, and then, oh yeah, testing, and integration, and then lastly, maintenance. And as you see, it is a circle. One should inform the other, and so on, because it is continuous. So tonight we're going to introduce you to a whole bunch of new concepts. If you're not a software developer, if you have not spent time working with software developers, if you have not been in a software development environment, a lot of this will be new. In the interest of time, I am going to move through a lot of this very quickly. We still have well over 100 plus slides to go. So just make sure to study this, go back and watch it on slow-mo or something. All right, initiation. So at some point, someone comes along and says, "I would like a thing that does not exist. Magic software people, can you make it?" And then we go, "Yeah, that sounds good." So that happens. That's the initiation. A lot of times, this is where we're going to gather requirements. We're gonna start getting resources. And then once we understand that, we begin the actual development. This is the development activities to build the system against the requirements. This could be things like purchasing code or creating infrastructure, writing code, purchasing software or APIs or other things we need to construct the system. Once the system has been constructed, then we move into the deployment and delivery phase. This is where we're actually going to stand it up and hand it over. And then once it's handed over, it becomes operationalized. Now it's production, and that is the operations and maintenance phase. Now, operations and maintenance, this is where patching comes into play. This is where, upgrading systems, all those things that need to happen are going to happen in the operations and maintenance phase. And then at some point, the software will no longer be viable. We will have upgraded technology. We've moved on to quantum. It runs on Windows 7. We don't support it. Whatever that is, we have to dispose of it. There's a security component to each one of these. We'll talk more about that as we go. So before we get too deep, though, got to introduce you to some methodologies for development. So developers think a very particular way. And depending on when they became a developer and how well they've kept up, they might be stuck in some older thinking. That older thinking is based around this idea of waterfall. Waterfall means I need every last detail about everything up front right now. And once I start building it, that's it. That's what I'm building. There will be no changes. It follows the requirement, design, implementation, testing, deployment, and maintenance phase. Again, this is very common. But the idea is that it's rigid. It is rigid. It is inflexible. I cannot move to the next stage until I have fully completed the previous stage. So all the tasks have to be completed before I can move on. It is not intended to be iterative. It is very rigid and rigorous. Now, the upshot of that is strict control around the process generally means that if I haven't accounted for it, I won't be surprised by it. But this is an older way of doing things. And frankly, very few people still do things this way. We'll talk more about the modern methods here in just a little bit, but know that it's no changes. That's it. It's all locked in stone. You signed off on the requirements. That's it. We don't want to talk about it until it's done and it's in production. That doesn't suit itself well for dealing with rapidly evolving security requirements. So we had to come up with a better way to do it. And that better way is known as Agile. And Agile has a bunch of different flavors. I'm not going to go into the full depth of the manifesto, but I do encourage you to look at it and learn it. There are 12 principles that make up the manifesto. Technically, Agile is not a development methodology, but is a set of guiding ideas. The highest priority is to satisfy the customer through early and continuous delivery of valuable software or minimum viable product. I need a calculator. What's it need to do? Well, today I need to add things up. Great. Here's a calculator that does addition. Well, tomorrow I need to subtract things. Okay, well, tomorrow I'll get you the subtraction. And the day after, maybe multiplication. So it's giving them something valuable, usable as early in the development as possible. Now, there's all kinds of like little gotchas about this, and then people are pro and for and against all the different Agile methodologies. Most important thing to understand is this is how the majority of software development is being done today. So it's very quick release. Each iteration goes to lessons learned. It's an iterative process. It is intended to evolve. It is intended to, we didn't get it fully right in the last release, so we're going to fix it in this release. This also can introduce security vulnerabilities, which is why you have to learn this stuff, right? Because there are security components to all of this. But the idea is that it's agile, hence the name Agile, right? It's responsive, it's flexible, it doesn't have to be perfect. I don't have to know every last detail up front. I just need to know enough to start to build the thing. Come on. All right. So Agile takes a couple of different approaches to how it's testing. You'll hear folks mention things like, test-driven Agile. The idea is that the more I do integrated testing, the more I can automate that testing, the higher the quality of the software I'm putting out, and the faster I can get it put out. So the idea is that I'm doing security testing as part of my build process, and we'll talk more about that as we get into CI/CD and continuous integration, continuous deployment. But the idea is that, again, I'm being agile, I'm being responsive, and I'm automating wherever I can. Now, Agile has different types of programming methodologies. So XP, or extreme programming, this is going to involve teams of developers and customers and user stories. User stories are a way to describe functionality, as well as acceptance criteria. So what's the definition of done? How do I know that addition machine I built actually adds? Well, when I put in a 1 and then I hit the plus sign and another 1, I get a 2. And as long as it does that, I accept it. That's my acceptance criteria. Extreme programming uses pair programming, so it's having multiple developers writing the code, giving advice and input. The idea here is you get a higher quality of code, also second set of eyes, and it can prevent collusion. Or somebody writing code that only they understand to protect their job. And for those of you old enough and have gray hair like me, that actually used to be something devs did. They would write code that you couldn't understand so that you couldn't fire them. Refactoring the code it means going through it, and what you're looking for, are there better, cleaner ways to do this? Do I have older code in there that's no longer as valid? Do I have redundant code in there that I can get rid of and make improved? So refactoring is part of XP as well. And junk code is known as cruft. Test-driven development, TDD. So the idea is I build the test case, and then I use the test. And then if the code fails against the test, then it's not good. We go back, we keep working it until we pass all the tests. The idea is all the tests pass before that code can be released into a productive system. There are many reasons why this is good. There are some reasons why this would hamper getting features out quickly enough. But you basically use TDD when you're developing against existing systems. You're making modifications and updates and additions and augmentations versus building from scratch. Then we have Scrum, and Scrum is a type of development methodology, and we'll talk more about that in a second. But operations and maintenance activities generally are falling outside. No, this is what the hell? Oh, sorry about that. Duplicate slide. There we go. Scrum. All right. So Scrum is a lightweight, been a few hours, set of team members continuously iterating development work. The idea is that we're meeting on this stuff. We're taking on very small chunks of work at a single time to get the feature, to get the function or the method, completed and published. Scrum Master is going to be the coach of the team, if you will. They're going to help organize the team to let the team self-organize their work. In a Scrum environment, the team is deciding what work they're taking on and how long it's going to take. This idea is that you empower them to make those decisions and you actually get stuff done faster instead of you telling them. Scrum teams are generally going to have a product owner. Product owner is going to be responsible for the overall product and product backlog. We'll talk about backlog in a second. The whole of that group, including QA and security and everybody, is considered the development team. And then backlogs are basically the list of requirements that have been captured for the particular piece of software. And then a sprint backlog is a smaller list of requirements of what we're actually going to work on in this 1 week, 2 week, or 3 week calendar cycle. So some of the key Scrum activities are sprints. Sprints are a time box set of work. In my experience, sprints generally come between 1 and 3 weeks. Sprint planning is the meeting that we're going to have to decide what's going to go in the sprint. How much of any given requirement is going to be worked on and addressed within that sprint. Daily Scrum is the meeting we're going to have to talk about how yesterday went and are there blockers. Blockers are things standing in the way of progress, right? Could be that somebody hasn't finished their code on a module that you need, or it could be that the patch that needs to get applied hasn't got applied, or leadership hasn't freed up funding, or whatever it might be. But the daily Scrum meeting or stand-up meeting, the idea is it's very short, 10 to 15 minutes maximum. And the goal is to keep the ball moving. The reason we refer to them as stand-ups is we found that if everybody stands up, the meeting ends a lot sooner. If we let people sit down, boy, we start getting into a 45-minute meeting. But if you make them physically stand, generally 10 to 15 minutes and we're out of there. Then you have 2 key events at the end of a sprint. So again, the sprint could be any number of time, 1 week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks. Generally, I don't see it longer than that. But at the end of it, we do a sprint review. So what got done? And this includes demoing that functionality to the customer. So hey, here's what we built this week. Now check it out. Does it meet your needs? Is it working the way you thought it was, et cetera? And then the sprint retrospective is to take a look at what worked well, what didn't work well, and what opportunities do we learn from our sprint review. Some of the other ways to look at this. So it's a visual. You have product backlog that's controlled by the product owner. They put during the sprint planning, we play a game that's called planning poker using Fibonacci sequence 1, 3, 5 or 1 through 5, blah, 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 blah. You basically weight. How real is it? Do you think you can get this done? Can you get this done within that 1 to 3 week? Okay. It goes through the sprint backlog. Then the development activities happen. Again, no more than 30 days. Generally, it's 2 weeks. Then you do a release, you get a sprint review, that goes to the retrospective, which then reinforms the backlog. So you may need to take things from last week's sprint and put them back in the backlog for this week's sprint because they didn't work. So just understand how that works. DevOps, or development operations, is the result of silos. In the old days, development would write code, they'd throw it over the wall to operations. Operations would go to deploy it. It wouldn't deploy, they'd throw it back to dev. And the fight began. Development would say, well, the server team didn't configure the server right. It's their fault. The code's not working. We did our job. Server team would say, development wrote really crappy code. It doesn't work. I can't deploy it. They didn't do their job. And this would go on for days, weeks, months, years. I mean, it's just a mess. And so finally somebody went, hey, we all work for the same company, right? We all have the same shared goal and outcome, right? We get the same paycheck. Maybe we should behave that way. And DevOps was born. The idea being that if we work together and we do more side by side, so dev is sitting right next to ops when they deploy, still respect separation of duties, but it cuts down on that over the fence blame game and gets us quicker to something being released that is functional. A lot of times automation and frequent testing is going to be a piece of it. We take this assembly line approach to it by pipelining, and we'll talk more about pipelining in a little bit. But the idea is that quality is built in from the word go, and we're all playing for the same sports team. QA is the third member of DevOps. I don't know why they were kind of left to the side, but they are. And so the idea is that all three groups that represent a successful deployment of software to production are involved in that deployment. Some other pieces here is that we need to think about from a security perspective. DevOps team members are generally going to have elevated levels of permission and access. They'll be able to make real-time changes to the production environment. So when that developer is sitting next to ops and ops says, hey man, your config file isn't configured right, dev can actually log into prod in real time and make that config change. You need a lot of controls around that. Just know that and make sure that, things like new users and permissions and who's accessing. It's very important to have good access control around this. It's very good logging. You're going to need to do additional monitoring. You're going to need to have additional security controls, especially if you're letting the person who wrote the code also, even under supervision, have administrative ability to edit or modify that code. You want to make sure you're enforcing least privilege and separation of duties as much as possible. Only give permissions that they need. So least privilege, right? What do you need to do your job? That's it. That's all you get. And temporal permissions can be quite helpful for this as well. Yeah, I'll give you admin for the next 25 minutes for you to fix it. And after that, that expires. Automation is super, super important, and we're doing more every day. Here's a visual of what DevOps is supposed to achieve. And the idea is that it's continuous. It is, I'm coding, I'm planning, I'm building, I'm testing, I'm releasing, I'm deploying, I'm operating, I'm monitoring, and my operations and monitoring are informing my plan, which then informs my code, and so on around the loop we go. I worked at an organization where we push code to production every 25 minutes because our DevOps process was sound and solid. So we were able to do that. We were able to do real-time updates all day long without disrupting production. It takes time to get there. All right, so let's go through the DevSecOps, which security, you noticed, wasn't part of DevOps. And so once again, we were brought in as the after the thought, the redheaded stepchild, the Department of No, and nobody liked us because they did all this great work to collaborate. And then we came along and went, yeah, you can't do that. So the idea then became, well, let's bring security to the party. Since they got to be involved anyways, let's get them involved on the front, middle, and back end of this process. So the DevSecOps manifesto says, leaning in, right? Don't be the Department of No, be the Department of How. Yeah, absolutely. We can do it. And here's how we can do it. Nobody likes the no person, right? So don't be that person. Use data and security science over fear, uncertainty, and doubt. Please don't be Chicken Little. Oh, if we do that, it leaves that port open and then we're going to get ransomware. Well, are we? Have we seen that? Or is there any evidence to support that? So use data and science and security science over fear. Be open to contributing and collaboration. Too many security practitioners take a security-only approach to things. It's ridiculous. You work for the business, support the business. I make decisions every day in support of the business that the security guy in me is like, it's a terrible idea. But the business guy in me is going, well, yeah, but that's what gets us paid. That's what keeps our customers happy. Have we mitigated the risk enough? Consumable security services with APIs over mandated security controls and paperwork. So again, hey, Dev, why don't you call this code scanner that'll scan the code instead of, hey, Dev, I need you to scan the code, right? This is a very different sounding phrase. I'm going to respond better when I feel like it's not overhead on me. So make sure that we're doing that. Business-driven security scores. This is where I'll plug Security Studio. That's what our mission is all about. It's what our product stack's all about, is putting risk into business context instead of just rubber stamping things, right? What is the actual risk? And is it aligned to the business? Do red and blue team exploit testing, right? instead of just scanning in theoretics, right? We don't just want to say, well, I found there's a vulnerability. Okay, but is it actually exploitable? And if so, how hard is it to exploit? Can our team exploit it in 30 seconds? Yeah, we're probably going to deal with it. Has the team been working on it all afternoon and made no progress? Maybe it's not a big deal. 24/7 proactive security monitoring. So being informed instead of reacting. You do not want to learn about a security incident after it's already happened. So being proactive is super important. Using shared threat intelligence over keeping info to ourselves. So no more fiefdom, right? If I know something's out there and I tell the dev, they might not implement that library. Let's say Log4j is a great example, right? Bunch of devs learn the hard way. Log4j creates problems. Maybe that's not the library for us to use. We'll talk more about libraries in a little bit. And then compliance operations over clipboards and checklists. Okay. I took time to read through all this because this is super important and it will make you a better security practitioner, even if you don't work on a DevSecOps team, which in the future, I don't know how you wouldn't. It's all about iteration over perfection. A lot of times the CISSP is going to be the red team or is going to play a role in the red team. Make sure that you're being supportive and helpful. Here's a visual of the difference between DevOps and DevSecOps. So here you'll notice that the sweet spot is the magic center of the Venn diagram, where security is part of all of it. They're part of application delivery, development, and IT operations, where in just traditional DevOps, security is brought in after the fact. There are other methodologies. Modified waterfall. This was the first attempt to make waterfall not as rigid. I do find this. Some of us have termed this scrum fall or wagile. But modified waterfall. So I've got my requirements and I'm pretty stuck in those requirements. However, I might entertain a change if it's really needed. So that's that modified waterfall. Spiral is really designed to be a repetitive series, very heavily focused on risk and analysis and evaluation. Massive projects are going to use this model. So very large, very complex, high spend projects a lot of times are going to use the spiral. You're going to determine your objectives, your alternatives, and your risks. If you're doing good risk math, everything here should be plus 100 minus 50. So if the dev says it's 10 hours, it's actually 20. And best case, it's done in 5. You're going to look at development and testing, and then you're going to plan the next phase. This is where the concept of gates, project gates comes in, and things like that. Prototype, just like it sounds. So this is, let me just whip something up right quick and see if this even works. Just going to test this idea. Unfortunately, prototype a lot of times becomes production. And those of you that have been in this long enough are probably laughing right now because you've lived through prototype turning into production. It works, great. Push it to prod. We're selling it tomorrow. So you want to be careful if you're doing prototypes to build in some controls to make sure that I think it sort of works, but I haven't really tested it very thorough, doesn't wind up in production. And then clean room methodology is really a lot of times it's known as zero defect. This is traditionally from the hardware world, making new processors and microcontrollers and things like that. You can do it in software, but again, it's a zero defect model. So it is making sure that your design is so perfect and your testing is so perfect that by the time it gets to production, there is literally zero chance for defect. Very few projects take that approach, and the ones that do, we count on to keep us alive. All right, maturity models. And if I'm moving too fast, somebody let me know. We still got a ton of content, so I'm just gonna keep crushing here. So maturity models are about seeing where we're at on a scale. Generally, that scale is 1 to 5, and it's focused around continuous improvement. We'll talk more a little bit later about the type of capability maturity models, but essentially it's baseline the current state, see how well we're doing in our processes, and are they formal, repeatable, and well managed, or are they ad hoc and chaotic? Okay, very important to understand there. So domains, right? That's going to help us. So as we look at the maturity, we use this in security all the time. The NIST tiers. Or the CMMI or the CMMC, these are all based on this idea of a 1 to 5 ranking of maturity from ad hoc, absolute chaos to very well managed, automated, documented, consistent, repeatable, and now I'm on to continuous improvement. We're going to use criteria to determine which level we're at. And then we're going to set targets for our desired maturity level. The more mature the process is, the lower the risk. It's going to reduce risk, but a lot of times maturating process comes with cost and complexity. It is so targets are generally going to be used to do gap analysis and prioritize the activities you're going to do. The most common is the CMM. Everything kind of grew out of this. This is the capability maturity model. It was developed by Carnegie Mellon and the Department of Defense. Because in the 1980s, it was, computers were growing in popularity and the software projects were just insane. It was, they'd go on for 2 years and nothing would even get done. So they said, wow, we really got to get a handle around this. We're spending tens of millions of dollars on nothing. And so they came up with this CMM model. The idea is that they used the best practice across successful projects that they had seen and said, what are they doing? And let's align to that. Now that grew and matured into the CMMI. And this is really the backbone of most common maturity models today. This is currently run by ISACA, but it was developed in partnership with DOD, US government, Carnegie Mellon, a lot of folks contributed to this. It is currently ran by ISACA, and it is what the majority of the maturity models now are based on. Take a quick look at the CMMI. So initial, again, it's unpredictable, it's chaotic, it's ad hoc. Managed, I'm trying to do some documentation. I'm doing the best I can, but I'm still pretty reactive to things. I'm still doing some chaotic ad hoc stuff. Defined, I'm proactive. I'm doing this. I'm doing things against processes across documented, repeatable steps, proactive steps. I'm doing risk management in the project, things like that. The next level is quantitatively managed. And these, I'm controlled by the measurements. My success is dictated by metrics and I respond to metrics. And then optimizing. And I'll be honest, I've been in this a long time and I've seen very few organizations ever get to true optimized. Level 5 is a bit of a dream, but it's a great goal to shoot for. And this is all about that process improvement. Can I do it better? Can I make it better? So then we have the software assurance maturity model, or the SAM. This is run by OWASP, the Open Web Application Security Project, and it's about baking security activities into an existing software development lifecycle, and it's giving a plan for assessing the current state, figuring out the target state, and then taking the appropriate improvements to move from current state to target state. Here's an example visually of what the SAM domains and practices look like: governance, design, implementation, verification, and operations. Hopefully you're picking up on a theme, whether it's the SDLC, whether it is the software assurance maturity model. There is a, what are we going to do? There's a plan phase, a governance phase. What the heck are we designing? Then there's the actual, what are we going to implement? How are we validating and verifying? And then how do we get it into an operational state? Within each practice, there are streams of activity. Again, I'm not going to read all this, but again, it's have I done my security testing manually, automated? Is it happening during development? Do I verify and check after we release to production that things have happened? Is it baked into the deployment process? Building maturity models in. So this is the software security initiatives. And here again, we're trying to bake security into the development model, into the software development lifecycle. If we could be there during the Scrum meetings, that's fantastic. If we can be part of the requirements development, that's even better. The sooner security is involved in the idea, the less costly security becomes, the less burdensome and cumbersome to the non-security team members it is. As much as possible, try to get involved early on. So again, here we have the Building Security and Maturity Model, or the BSIMM, which is coming from the Software Security Group. There are 121 activities across 4 domains. We are not going to go into all of that, but I do encourage you to look into it. But it comes down to governance, intelligence, software development lifecycle, software security development lifecycle, and deployment. Again, the whole idea is security baked into this at every step along the way? Then we have the CMMC, or as I call it, the 800-171 moving target that the DoD can't figure out what they want to do with. I say that in jest because I'm living through this right now, but the CMMC was an idea that in order to provide technological solutions to the Department of Defense, you need to be able to demonstrate where you are in the maturity model. So the CMMC is very closely related to the CMMI. It's a level 1 through level 5, again, performed up to optimizing. It is 800-171 with some 853 peppered in for controls. The areas it's looking at are access control, asset management, audit accountability, awareness and training, configuration management. All of this should look very familiar to the classes we've gone through these last few weeks, right? Incident response, and how do I protect and do maintenance, and personnel and recovery, risk management. And what the CMMC is trying to establish is within these categories, are you doing it by a repeatable process? Is it ad hoc and chaos? This helps the Department of Defense make a risk determination about your solution or your business based on how well you're performing in these categories. And that'll come down to what is the product or service that you provide them. If you are a business that is providing the Department of Defense leaflets for handing out at the graduation ceremony, you're probably going to be lower on the scale. But if you're producing the pin for the door that keeps the nuclear reactor shut, you're probably going to be at a much higher level of the CMMC. So moving on from that into operations and maintenance, this is production. This is all about that production environment and maintaining it. When we move from development into production, we will a lot of times refer to that as promoting or deploying or pushing to production. Once we're in production, we have security things we need to be doing. We need to be continuing to keep up with the continuity. Are we doing things that we've accounted for in our continuity plans, our recovery plans, our cyber resilience plans? Making system backups, validating those backups, all those things happen under this O&M or operations and maintenance area. Monitoring and incident response is going to happen here. Vulnerability and patch management is going to happen here. Access control is going to happen here. And change and configuration management, which we learned about in chapter 7, but is super important. So important, in fact, we have a whole slide about it. So as a reminder, change management is all about maintaining a known secured state. And when I make a change, making sure that when I'm done changing, I'm still in a known secured state. Change management generally is not going to be part of the security department, but you have an active role to play in its process. Generally, your role will be reviewing the change for any potential security impacts. You may trigger security processes by doing the change. So for example, let's say you have a security control in place that says if the hash of this file, you have file integrity monitoring in place, changes, then it's going to send an alert and it's going to block access. Well, if I know I'm going to be changing that file, this is a planned change, then I might temporarily disable that, or I might put it in an exception state so I can do my change without triggering the security process. And this is critically important if you're using anything like a security orchestration automated response, and we'll talk more about that a little later. Change management is going to have different rigor depending on the impact of the change. So that's the important part to take away, is you review them for security impacts, and depending on that impact, you could take different processes. Change management is generally going to happen at an organizational level. This is going to be things like upgrading the operating system, moving to the cloud, putting up new infrastructure, or it's going to happen at the source code level. We're actually changing code and making changes there. So you can apply change management at different levels. As a reminder, it's all about maintaining and staying in a known good secured state. We do also at time will freeze, do what's called a freeze, either a code freeze or a system freeze. We say, okay, we've reached a state of completion. We are now done making changes and we're going to stop that. And it's important to freeze during change. I'm sorry, at the end of change, because you need to be in that stable state for long enough to go validate that the security controls you expect to be working are working, that you have not introduced any new risks, and that everything went smoothly. Some of the, and we talked about this a little earlier, so I'll breeze through this pretty quick, but essentially you have a board of some sort who is responsible for reviewing, approving, and advising on the change. This should be comprised of members from IT, security, and other teams as appropriate from different inputs as required from different stakeholders within the business. The change management board is ultimately responsible for shepherding the change management process. Change management process is generally going to flow like this. There's a request. Somebody says, hey, I'd like to make a change. Then the CMB is going to get together, or the CRB or the CAB, and they're going to look at it. They're going to do an analysis. They're going to say, well, what does this change really mean? What's the impact? What are the security considerations? And then they're either going to approve it or they're going to deny it and say, we're not making the change, or go back to do it. Yes, B, it means you have to be in the CAB meeting. Sorry, they're not always fun. And a lot of times we don't have something immediate, but we do need to be present, or at least get a report out that we can add input to prior to the actual approval. Change development. So, okay, great. We believe the change you proposed is safe and sane. Let's get it built. Then we're going to implement that change. We're actually going to put that change into production. And then we're going to test. Did it work? Now, where a lot of people go wrong here is they don't have a rollback plan. They don't have a backup plan for implementation. They forgot to make a backup before they applied the change. That's where security can step in and help. Hey, did you make a backup of that? If we need to roll it back, could we? Then we're going to test it, and then we're going to do a post-mortem or an after action, or whatever you want to call it. But the idea is we're going to go, okay, did this work? What worked well? What didn't work well? What is the new state? Is there additional training we have to do now because of this? So on and so forth. Process improvement. Then my favorite change, emergency change. Emergency change. Never had a good day when doing an emergency change, but it is basically saying this change has to happen. It has to happen now, and we need to minimize the delays as much as practical. So in this case, we're probably going to be running in a very reduced capacity. A single member may grant approval. Maybe a critical, actively exploiting vulnerability came out, and we need that patch put in, and we need it put in now. That's going to be an emergency change. Testing and verification are going to be very streamlined. There is not a lack of process. There's a delay. There's a modification of it and then a delay. So the idea is to emergency changes should happen very quickly. And then we go back after the fact and do the supporting documentation, the deeper regression testing, the deeper security assessments, the vuln scanning, pen testing, and so on, depending on the nature of the change. So standard change, lots of planning. Emergency change, get it done, and let's figure out what happened after. Integrated product team. Integrated product team is going to be this is a little bit of a newer concept. The idea is that it's got all these multidisciplinary individuals who have a collective responsibility for developing the product. So this could be DevOps, DevSecOps, dev team, agile. There could be leadership stakeholders. There could be customer stakeholders, etc. The idea is that they are going to have all the resources needed with all the relevant roles, skills, and knowledge that would be relevant to a successful project. They're going to do product and process design, and again, trying to do that holistic set of requirements. And it's going to it relies on extensive modeling and testing, both of the system and any prototypes that are going to be used. Okay, whew. You guys keep it up. We're at slide 100, only 100 more to go. Quick dad joke for you. What rock group has 4 men who don't sing? Mount Rushmore. All right. Hopefully somebody's chuckling. This is that's the only downside to talking to a blank wall. All right, we're going to talk about how to apply security controls in the software development ecosystem. So what we need to do is we need to understand the criticality of software security. Okay, so what is the software doing? What security controls are in there? You do need to have a generalized understanding of programming and the various risks that come with it. We're not going to go too deep into all that yet tonight. This is more higher level. If you don't know, Code Academy is a great site you could go check out, and for an hour or two of your time investment, you'll understand the ins and outs of programming, at least at a high level. Make sure you understand how modern programming is being done and what security tools are designed to be integrated with and provide data to the developers during their development of the software. So programming languages, just like human language, we have to talk to the computer somehow. In the old days, binary doesn't work to talk to the computer. I'd still be typing out one of the slides in binary if that's how I had to talk to the computer. So we came up with these programming languages that allow us to communicate with the computer using human words. And we refer to those programming languages and those words as syntax. Syntax allows us to tell the computer how to interact with things like data and systems. When we put that syntax together into more than one word, we create algorithms and specific sets of instructions. And just like we use sentence and paragraph and punctuation to convey meaning in human language, programming languages also have logical structures to them. Compiled languages are translated into machine readable format before being run. That process is known as compiling. So the developer writes a bunch of words using that syntax, and then before that code can actually be run by the computer, it has to be compiled. It has to be turned into those ones and zeros. And that process is known as compiling. And then the output is called a binary. Well, why is it a binary? Because it's full of ones and zeros. And for those of you that have to drop because we're running late tonight, please do. I am going to go all the way to the end because we need to stay on schedule, but please check back out when you have time and pick up where you left off. Compiled programs can only be run for the system in which they were compiled. So if I build it for a Mac, I can't run it on a Windows. If I build it on a Windows, I can't run it on a Linux. Compiled programs protect source code. So what the file that gets distributed is the binary. So if someone opens up that binary, they're not going to see the actual computer code. They're going to see the ones and zeros that were created during the compiling process. This is a way to preserve confidentiality. And if you're of the hacking type, this is where you reverse engineer binaries to figure out what the source code was. But that can be very difficult. C# and Swift are examples of compiled languages. We also have interpreted languages. Interpreted languages are going to be, JavaScript is the most common one, right? It's going to be code that will run on a multitude of systems, but it has to be interpreted, and something has to turn it from that human readable into a machine readable form. In the case of Python and JavaScript, these are interpreted languages. There are interpreters that will then turn that into the ones and zeros. Just understand the difference. Interpreted languages, you can read the source code. So no protection of intellectual property in a interpreted language. A compiled language, you cannot read the source code. Mobile code, because it is dynamic, so interpreted code a lot of times can also be mobile code, means that there's possibility that the code could be modified by an attacker, and any of the previously tested code might not actually be loaded, but an attacker's malicious code could be loaded instead. So understand that. Database systems and specialty systems also have their own language. SQL, for example, has the structured query language. It also has the data definition language and the data manipulation language and data control language. So these are different types of languages and syntax that you use to interact with the to interact with the SQL server with the structured query language. You could also have, like in SAP, for example, ABAP. ABAP is the language of SAP. So there can be many different types of languages. Some of the things that we're going to get into now are type checking and type safe languages. So static type checking is performed by the compiler. It's verifying that the program's functionality matches the type constraints for data inputs. So if I'm expecting a number, am I getting a number? If I'm expecting a Boolean, a yes or no, am I getting a Boolean? If I'm expecting text, am I getting text? I'm checking those types against my data inputs. Dynamic type checking is going to check the value stored in the variable at runtime. So it's actually looking to see that the data at the point of runtime matches the expected type, where static is looking at the point of compiling to see that it matches. Strongly typed languages require that all variable type declarations be checked at the compile, while a loosely or weakly typed language allows for dynamic checking when an application is run. Depending on the system availability requirements and the security requirements, you should be able to help make that decision as to whether a strong or weak language may need to be used. Yes, one other thing to understand is if you do not match types, this is where things like SQL injection can come into play, right? You can actually pass it a bit of data it's not expecting, it doesn't know what to do with, and that could potentially expose an opportunity to inject code. So make sure you're doing that. Declarative programming is expressing the logic of a task without actually saying how the task should be executed. And in these languages, the system has to figure out the logic and then execute the task to support that logic. An imperative paradigm of programming uses statements or commands to change the state. So things like common human language, like stand up or study for the CISSP, it can prevent a bit of a security challenge. It's going to focus on the use of procedures or subroutines or functions, which give greater control. So instead of writing the addition, add 1 to 2, I might call a function and just say, add these numbers. Standardized subroutine for accessing data in the file systems. Check that for access control flaws. Each time the subroutine is reused, then it will be assured that it's implementing the access controls in a consistent manner. So you can actually implement within the code itself different security control mechanisms. Procedural programming is related to imperative paradigm, and it's based on the concept of calling procedures, which are similar to routines or subroutines, and procedures are a set of steps to be executed. And then those steps are allowed to be logically grouped and called dynamically when needed. Block structure programming languages use blocks as an organizational unit, and the scope of the program elements like variables and functions is restricted to the block, which prevents any conflict with other elements that might be in the code. Object-oriented programming, or OOP, is focused around objects rather than actions. So instead of giving specific instructions to gather input data and perform procedures, object-oriented programming is going to treat data as an object and function as an object. And generally, we're going to describe those objects as classes, and then we can link classes together through defined interactions. And if any of this is just completely new, you've never heard any of these terms before, I do encourage you to take a quick intro to programming course. An object is anything that has a state that can be tracked. So this could, be things like, process of encryption or other, specific functions. OOP has a lot of security concepts. The nice thing with object-oriented programming is you can actually build security controls into the classes and then inherit those security controls. So you can just call that class from an object and say, I want to apply those particular security controls. Some programming paradigms, encapsulation. So this is data hiding. It's putting something inside of something and then restricting access to it. Inheritance, which I just mentioned, is the ability of me to inherit. Think of this as like a parent-child type relationship. I inherited my father's brown eyes. I inherited his black hair, and I inherited his bad sense of humor. Polymorphism. So poly meaning multiple, right? Latin for multiple, and morphs being Latin for forms. So it can take many forms when it is instantiated. So you can create a new object, instantiate a new object from an existing object that is essentially a duplicate of that object, but has different data types it may interact with. There are security concerns there because a new data type could require different security controls or different methods to be called. Polyinstantiation, that's a mouthful, means taking multiple, again, poly, copies, instances of an object with the goal of supporting different levels of confidentiality and integrity for that object. Operating systems a lot of times use polyinstantiation. Virtual memory is going to fall under that. Every time you open up a new browser window, you're polyinstantiating a browser window within the browser object, and so on and so on. Know this stuff. Some languages. So continuing on with languages, we have markup and scripting languages. One that we're probably all most familiar with is the hypertext markup language, or the code of the web, right? It's how we talk to web browsers. It's what we see. Cascading style sheets, or CSS, are going to help us be consistent in what fonts and color, fonts and colors and layouts and spacing, etc. JavaScript is a scripting application that we can use. Python, also very similar scripting language, high-level language, uses small programs, but can also build large web applications. It is an interpreted language, and a lot of times it's going to use API calls, and we'll talk more about API calls here in a minute. So libraries are why we're able to move as quickly as we are. So the idea is that if I write the calculator app, I write the thing that says 1 + 2, instead of me having to write that every single time I want to use it, I can put that inside a library and I can call that library. Libraries also are known as code, classes, scripts, procedures, right? We have a lot of different names for it, but the idea is that it is a collection of functionality that I can then pull from instead of having to rewrite it from scratch. If I had to write every single line of code from scratch, we'd still be back in the 90s. Software development kits are a way for developers to interact with certain platforms and operating systems, social networks. For example, if I want to interface with the Android system, I want to write an app that runs on Android, I'm going to interface with the Android software development kit, because I'm not going to write the code to display on the screen and detect the touch. I'm going to pull that out of that SDK. Using SDKs and libraries is going to, speeds up development, but it does, and it can increase the dependability, because we're using standard stuff that's already been pretty tested. And a lot of times these libraries have come from the community. And so all the security issues are well known and addressed. Really does help you develop code faster. Libraries can also have compliance focused features in certain compliance requirements, regulated functions, credit card processing. Let's say I need to process some credit card data. Well, instead of me trying to build that myself, I could call a approved credit card handling library approved by PCI DSS, and that can help me with my compliance because I didn't spin it up myself. Learn more about libraries. They are where all the code these days comes from. So when I want to write some code, I need tools to do that. Those tools are going to be source code editors. This could be something as simple as Notepad. Notepad is the original source code editor for me. But there are really cool source code editors that help you with things like checking syntax and making sure you have the right comma in the right place, etc. Code repositories and revision control tools. GitHub, right? This is where GitHub lives. You have debuggers and bug databases. These are things that help you to troubleshoot your code and to find known errors in your code. Compilers, we talked a little bit about that previous. This is the piece of computer code that's going to actually assemble my human words into those ones and zeros. And then testing tools. And this is where security really is benefiting from some of this advancement in tech. You can bake in a lot of automation. Yep, Ted, Notepad++, that's my jam. Especially the compare feature, really cool for troubleshooting data too. But testing tools are going to help you to do things like static code analysis and unit testing. A lot of times testing tools can be automated. You can do data flow analysis. You can do fuzzy testing. You can actually do security testing with some of this. So it's very cool stuff. I encourage you to check it out. To the comment in the chat about Visual Studio Code. So IDEs, or integrated development environment. In the old days, I had to have 50 different little programs to build a piece of software. And that now I can do that all through this control called an IDE. I have a single pane of glass that has all the things I need. It's got a source code editor, it's got a debugger, it's got automation, compilers and testing and deployment, all that stuff baked in, up to and including connecting to things like Docker and Kubernetes. So IDEs do also have security concerns, and you need to investigate and address those as well. Now, runtime. Runtime is what happens when the code is actually running. Runtime is the ones and zeros are moving through the processor. So a lot of times, systems that are very complex during runtime might reach out to other code or firmware. Firmware is software that lives in the hardware. Device drivers, right? Device drivers are another type of software that might be called. So we want to make sure we understand the security impact of that. And then if we're using high security, if it's a high security application, we might be using something like a trusted computing base. We may be calling other hardware security appliances that are, unique and specific to our system. Again, big thing to understand here is runtime is when the code is actually going through the processor and other factors could come into play. So even if you tested all the code, even if you tested the build and you did all this stuff, if you haven't actually tested it during runtime, there could be risks that you have not yet discovered. Moving on to continuous integration and continuous delivery. So continuous integration is the practice of merging code into a shared location, of commonly known as a repository, or as we call it, branching and trunking. So when we put the branch back into the trunk, right, that's a CI activity. The idea is that if we continue to do rapid development and we are integrating very frequently, we're less likely to discover issues after the fact. We're less likely to experience delays in those issues because we're failing fast. We're finding things quickly. We're fixing things quickly, and our code is kind of always up to date. Continuous CI/CD, again, integration. You can bake security testing in. One of the cool things you can do in a CI/CD configuration is say, okay, when the developer goes to hit build, as step one of the build process, I do a static code analysis, and then they build. But before it pushes to production, I do a dynamic code analysis, and maybe I do a vuln scan, right? So I can actually bake my security automation directly into the build process. The developer loves this because it's less heartache for them. We love it as security practitioners because we know that our security testing is happening every single time because it's part of the process. So CI/CD, really cool stuff. And again, in the interest of time, I'm gonna move through some of this a little bit quicker, but please do go back and check these things out. Closely related. So again, of course, CD, right? CD, continuous deployment, continuous delivery, make it really confusing. But essentially it is the automatic deployment of code to production without any manual intervention, unless one of the automation step fails. So for example, if my static analysis says, "Ooh, there's SQL injection vulnerabilities in this code," it'll stop the process. Otherwise, if everything passes the process, then it automatically deploys it to production. So we want to make sure we're leveraging that wherever possible. And this is becoming more common as dev shops are moving to the modern model. A lot of times the process from start to finish is referred to as the CI/CD pipeline. So this is everything from writing the code and dealing with the errors and testing it and scanning it and packaging it and building it and deploying it, right? That whole process is known as the pipeline. CI/CD is going to pipelines are going to rely very heavily on automation. and definitely we want to do that. You can do things like stand up servers, right? You could do a call to Azure and spin up a virtual web server as part of the build process through the pipeline. It's going to, a lot of times you're going to be doing this stuff directly against the cloud. The more that you understand about your pipeline, the more that you're able to get involved and put in those small, automated, repeatable security checks within the pipeline, the less likely a security vulnerability is to make it into production. Application security is another part of the CI/CD pipeline. So, when we do testing, we're doing unit testing, functional testing, regression testing, and that's all awesome because that's going to tell me my code works as designed. But what that's not accounting for is security specific testing. So I'm going to need to test the app. This could be things like running it through a code quality analysis tool. It could be things even like pointing Metasploit at it if I really wanted to. But we could do that security specific testing baked in. The idea is that DevOps and DevSecOps are working together to put as much automated security testing and control into the pipeline as possible. This could be the developers, calling specific code functions that add security at the code level, all the way through doing any type of security testing. Security orchestration, automation, and response. So I mentioned this earlier tonight, or SOAR. The idea of this is that if I'm able to detect a known security incident with a known means of addressing it, that I can then leverage automation to do that. So instead of me getting a ticket, the SIM reported, I got an alert, that alert went to an email. Now my analyst took a look and they escalated it to my responder, who then got involved to fix it. I can bake a lot of that into the security orchestration, automation, and response. One thing not on the slide to know about this is the better your inventory, the better your understanding of the ecosystem of the application, the better SOAR works. If you try to implement SOAR, but you do not have a basic inventory, if you do not know what data criticality you have, if you have not done any basics of the fundamentals of code security, you're probably making an investment that's going to create more nightmare for you than actually help. However, when you do have some of these more mature things in place, SOAR can be a really cool thing. Generally, SOAR is going to get its data from the SIM, but it's also going to collect from other data sources, intrusion prevention systems and detection systems, data loss prevention systems, policy management, etc. So orchestration is where SIM and SOAR have some overlap. They bring in this disparate data set, but where the SIM is really just doing log aggregation, log comparison, SOAR is going to go beyond that. It's going to tap into things like entity behavior and analytics, IPS, IDS, external threat, anti-phishing tools, anti-malware. So it's really going to leverage the totality of your security tooling and can also be fully customized through APIs as well. So you can really bake it in good. Automation is exactly that. It's going to follow playbooks. So if you are familiar with the concept of playbooks, they basically say, when this happens, do these things in this order. If these things are true, then these are the actions to take. I absolutely, again, go back to the better your inventory, the better your foundations and fundamentals, the better this stuff works. And then response, right? So response is all about exactly that. Can I offline the network? Maybe I move it to an isolation VLAN. Maybe I automatically apply a patch. Maybe I deprovision access to sensitive data, or whatever that risk is that I'm automatically responding to. I want to take a response that's appropriate for addressing that risk, mitigating that risk, whatever I'm doing there. Now, there's still a human component, right? There's still stuff that SOAR is not necessarily going to be able to do, or there can be things where, hey, yeah, it responded to this stuff, but why did it respond? Like, we need to dig deeper, because maybe that's an indicator of a larger event happening that we didn't have an automation playbook for, that we didn't have data coming in for. So SOAR can't handle it. Now my human needs to get involved. Okay, dad joke for you. except I didn't set this one up right. So it moves in reverse. And it says, every time I take my dog to the park, the ducks try and bite it. And that's what I get for buying a purebred dog. That's what happens when you build slides at 2 in the morning. All right, software configuration management, SCM, very important. It is about managing change and change management practices that are aligned to and supporting secure software development. You want to maintain integrity around the code and the program resources, like the requirements documentation. So if we're doing configuration management correctly, we will have a configuration item assigned as a unique identifier, and the configuration item will have a set of steps that we need to take to ensure that the changes are coordinated and are not introducing any additional flaws, breaking functionality, or exposing risk. We generally are going to use a baseline to set that bar, to say these are a set of immutable configuration items that are providing functionality to the system. This can also be used in the context of security controls. So baselines, if you remember before, are that minimum bar. These are the least amount of things we absolutely have to do. And it's very important to understand that and have that baked in as well. The chief goal of any software configuration management is to promote visibility and control over the state of change, right? Change could be, I'm adding a new feature. Change could be the bad guy compromised the library and is now exfiltrating data. So the better I manage those changes, the better I tie them back to my configuration items, the more likely I am to be able to detect approved positive change from unapproved potential negative change. We're going to be looking at things like ensuring that change does not violate the confidentiality, integrity, availability, non-repudiation, and authenticity. And if you haven't seen this acronym yet, the CIANA. I don't even know how to pronounce that, but basically it's all the security things lumped together. The idea again is, have I honored the CIA, non-repudiation, and authenticity in this change, and can I prove it? And if you're doing this really well, an unapproved change could actually be an actionable security event. So if you have your change control dialed in nice and tight, then anything that violates that could automatically be flagged as an active threat requiring investigation. Code repositories, this is a big one. So, GitHub is one, Team Foundation, gosh, there's a bunch out there, right? But it's basically, it's the database or the system, the back end, if you will, that provides a centralized location for storing code. Storing the code and securing the code repository, super important. We have seen all kinds of interesting things happening lately around GitHubs and other code repos that are not properly secured or monitored. So we want to make sure that we're doing that. So you guys all know these terms. I'll skip through this one, but definitely make sure if you don't know these terms, memorize this. The other thing we want to think about when we're protecting the repository is the data. So do we have DLP in place? What happens if that intellectual property was to be accessed or compromised? How are we securing the communication between our internal network and the code repository network? Are we using secured communication methods? Do we require TLS or VPN or proxy? How are we controlling access control to that library? And a lot of times these days, your repo is calling other public repos. There's a lot of consumption of open source public repos. And so making sure that we understand the access control there and that we're not making calls out to other repos that we don't necessarily control, and bringing things in that would violate confidentiality, integrity, non-reputability, or availability, that we've accounted for that. Backup and availability as well, very important. Want to make sure that the code is available in the event that we need it. Getting into application security testing. So there's a couple different ways to go about this. So the static application security testing is exactly It's static. It's going to look at the compiled binaries, and it's generally going to be run in a development or test environment. They are not, static analysis is not generally run against production. There are disadvantages to that, which is obviously the complex vulnerabilities that might be tying into things like driver files, firmware, operating system exploits, etc., will not be detected by a static analysis. Dynamic, on the other hand, is going to run at runtime. It's going to generally going to do this with an API. It doesn't really matter what the language is. It's not tightly tied to the integrated development environment. Non-developers a lot of times are more able to access the results of this, where static a lot of times lives on the dev side only and can't be as easily accessed by the security folks. Some of the disadvantages to DAST are that it is outside the developer's tool set. So there could be organizational changes in getting the right information to the right developer. That's going to really come down to how well your dev process works and how, whether you're agile or not, those things play a bigger role. You're going to have interactive application security testing, or IAST, which is a combination of SAST and DAST. This can include things like pen testing and complex algorithms. There are the disadvantage, which is that it's language dependent, so it doesn't support all languages, and potentially can also cause performance issues. So we'll see how that plays over time. It's a relatively newer approach. Runtime application self-protection, or RASP. Boy, I just love our acronyms. It is it's incorporated. It's kind of a complement to SAST and DAST. I don't know. I don't have a lot of experience with this one, but the idea is it's like SOAR for security testing, I guess, if I was to kind of frame that. All right. So assessing the effectiveness of security of the software security, you need to do this over time. So it all starts with basic assessment and testing, right? And then logging and auditing changes. We've covered a lot of this, but the idea is that at multiple steps through that development life cycle, I need to be able to see that the things I'm expecting to happen are actually happening. Okay. And part of how I do that is through audit and logging of change. Now, a standard Windows 10 workstation in any given day is going to generate tens of thousands of logged events. And if you're like Ryan in the early days and you're like, I know how to solve this, I'll turn on logging. And then you forgot to, I don't know, check to see if you had enough disk on the server. Before you did that, you might wind up going, I'm so sorry, I don't know why it won't reboot. So don't do that, but do have some kind of logging. There's some key events that you want to log, and some of those are things like, permission elevation and rebooting and other things that I might need to keep visibility over or provide visibility to when I'm troubleshooting security events. Auditing and logging are different. They are used interchangeably, but they are different. So they have their own definition, and that definition is this: auditing is an official systematic inspection of something. Okay. Auditing is focusing on the implementation and effectiveness of, in this case, software security controls. They're going to follow a standard. Okay. Logging is the recording of events. It is simply the gathering of the data created through by the system through the various events that happen. Auditing is the actual reviewing of them, looking at how well they've been implemented and how effective they are. Some top things to think about logging, or top things for logging: accountability. Who is going to do this? Log files are useless if you don't look at them. Log files are useless if they don't have enough information in them to tell you anything or be actionable. So for example, if you don't have a username or timestamp associated with the log entry, is it really telling you anything? Probably not. The other one is non-repudiation. So really good bad guys like to go in and edit logs, change logs, clean up their mess. System engineers that made a big mistake, or system admins that made a big mistake and don't want to get yelled at, might go in and clean up a log. So have you ensured non-repudiation around the log itself? For highly sensitive systems, it is advisable to use a forensic offsite one-way write log box or forensic black boxing, right? This is sending the data off to a third party that only takes it in. There's no editing of it after the fact. That's for really highly sensitive systems, but that's one option. There are other non-repudiation options you can use. Group policy can help with that. Logs are going to generate both for and routine audits are both going to be reactive and detective controls. So if you are logging the correct level of detail and you are looking at that log in the correct frame, it can be a detective control, it can be a reactive control, so it can help satisfy some of your security requirements. Logs are generated after the fact. They do not tell you what's happening as it's happening. They do not tell you what has happened before it has happened. They will tell you what has happened after it's done. You absolutely have to make use of them. If you don't look at the logs, I don't know what the point of collecting them is. SIM tools, or security incident event managers, or log aggregators, as I call them, are going to ingest the log data. It's going to help you to take these tens of thousands of disparate events and organize it together. Graylog is good. Splunk is really great if you are going to use Splunk. I see some chat here. If you're going to use Splunk, I want you to know you need a full-time Splunk engineer, at least one, preferably 3. It is incredibly expensive. It is very robust and complete, but it does require very specialized skills to make it meaningful. Otherwise, you have paid for a very big thing that does not do what you hoped it would. Audits, again, formal, structured. Assessments are an informal version of auditing. Log data is absolutely critical for audits. It is the system of record. It's going to say, yes, this happened, or no, this didn't happen. So make sure you know that. Source code management is particularly important when logging and auditing. So you should also be logging events within source code. Yes, James, I think you can quote me on my Splunk comment. The source code management is who made that change, what changed, right? So it's often an overlooked area. So we want to make sure we're logging that. And also logs can be very helpful for troubleshooting. So when we're doing like a new feature or functionality, it might be helpful to ask the developer to log an event with an event code that's easily identifiable. That way we can look and say, oh, I see the output here. I see what's going on, and it helps us to make that change or improve that code. Access reviews, big part of it, quarterly, change management, right? Why did it change? What changed? Who changed it? How did it change? What was the impact? Security incidents, very important piece here. Logs are basically how we know that we've even had an event, right? Like, wow, why is that server all of a sudden sending all this data? Well, how do we become aware of that? By looking at the logs, either the sys logs from the firewall, or we're looking at the system log from the box. Performance management, logs are going to help us understand things about performance. Are we running into issues with thrashing on a database, right? I remember one time I used database logs to troubleshoot the fact that one of the developers wrote a nested cursor that had 70 levels of nesting. You don't want any part of that, by the way. It's a mess. But if you do end up needing that, you can use logs to help that. And then cloud, right? I need to log the cloud too. How do I want to make sure, or how am I making sure that what the cloud provider has told me is happening is actually happening? And are they making any changes that I'm not aware of? Okay, different applications for logging and auditing. So I encourage you to check out the NIST Special Publication 892, Guide to Computer Security Log Management. Very, very helpful document. OWASP also has a logging cheat sheet. That's all I'm going to say about this slide. Go look at those 2 documents. It'll tell you everything you need to know. So when we're doing software development auditing, we need to audit artifacts. And there's a requirements phase we need to go through. So we need to do an audit against requirements. So one of the big areas these days that we're doing this is against privacy. And we're doing a privacy impact assessment, data classifications and categorizations. We want to make sure we're understanding what we're building and that we've thought about the auditing needs of the software as we're building, and ideally before we even begin building. Then we get into the design phase. And this is making sure that we've actually done the appropriate key activities to be audited. So if we're using a cloud system, are we pulling the appropriate access logs from the cloud? If we're doing on-prem, are we pulling from the on-prem? We're ultimately making sure that we have documented it enough to get to a status of formal acceptance of the residual risk. Then we have the implementation phase. So these are activities that need to be logged, like writing code and uploading code and changing the branch. And are we doing code reviews or pen tests? All those things need to be logged and tracked. We need to log our testing. We need to verify. So not only do I want to log the fact you tested, but now I want to audit the testing itself. Is the testing truly doing the thing it's supposed to be doing? And then, like all things, operation and maintenance, right? Lots of auditing here, lots of auditing. The good news is we're getting better at automating a lot of this stuff. We're getting better at baking these things in, but there are laws and regulations as well. If I'm in the banking industry and I issue somebody credit, I better have a damn good audit history on how I did that and what decisions went into that, and make sure that I have that transparency. I have some friends of mine in the machine learning space doing the AI stuff. And one of the challenges they're running into now is auditing the AI model. How do I get the audit? How do I get the AI to report to me enough detail that I can log and audit it so that I understand the decisions it's making when it's making a gajillion decisions a second? Then we got to do our risk analysis and mitigation. So during the SDLC, we want to continue to assess risk and do as much ongoing mitigation as possible. The goal here is the same as always. It's identifying the assets we want to protect. It's understanding the likelihood and the impact of the vulnerability and threats, and then coming up with the most cost-effective way to manage the risk. And honestly, this one right here, this is what you should be thinking about the entire time you're taking the CISSP. When you're taking this exam, you should be looking at every single question through this lens. Am I looking at it as a manager of risk? Am I looking at the question in front of me and the way they're asking it in a context that allows me to answer the question from a risk management viewpoint? That is really what this is all about at the end of the day. So that's a really great way to describe it. And I encourage you, as you do take your exam, keep that in mind. You know, what they're really after is, do you know how to think about this stuff? And do you understand your default settings should always be, let's talk about how critical the asset is. Let's talk about likelihood and impact. And then let's talk about what we might or might not do about that. Software risks require unique analysis. So you need to figure out what your targets are and how you're going to do your analysis. Some deeper things to think about are data risks. So how is the data moving? Is the data traversing different levels of classification and sensitivity depending on how it was collected, by where, by whom? Is it looking, or am I moving it from a highly sensitive system to a lower sensitivity system? And so on and so forth. The other thing is technology is evolving at a gajillion miles an hour. And somewhere in my dev project, midway, somebody's going to come along and go, hey, did you see this cool new thing? And we decided to use it. Okay, well, what do I know about that? What technology is that doing? What security support do I need to provide? What type of maintenance is going to be required? And generally speaking, newer tech generally comes with lower levels of expertise, lower levels of knowledge about how it works, more bugs. And so, we need to look at that and take that into account. Then there are system changes. So as we migrate, what happens if I take this code that worked really well on 2012 R2 and I move it to 2019? Does it present new risks? Does it get rid of old risks? Right? I need to understand that. I need to think about the code itself. And this is especially important when we're using open source libraries from God knows where sources. What's in that code? Just because I'm calling one function, maybe it's got 50 other functions in it, and I need to understand what those functions are if I'm going to implement the whole library. All right, risk assessment and treatment. Good news is we're about 50 slides out from the finish here. I'm not going to go through all this. I'm just going to tell you, just like every other thing you've seen so far, think about it, plan, write down what it is, requirements, figure out how you're going to do it, design, actually build the darn thing, development, and then how am I going to run and maintain it, operations, right? Know this stuff, live it, love it, learn it. It applies everywhere. It applies to BIAs, BCPs, DR plans, software dev. It is the backbone of security to go through these phases. So know the phases and know they apply in many different places. Mitigation strategies, same thing. The cost benefit analysis here. What am I doing? Is it truly worth my time and effort? Is it going to help the business, hurt the business? Just because we think it's a great idea as security people, even if it's the best right idea, it might be inconsistent with the business need. Same thing here. We're going to measure. We're going to think about our mitigating strategies. If I'm going to spend $1 of the company's money, what am I spending it on? Is it really helping to achieve a business goal? Or am I just trying to be Mr. Fancy Pants security guy, right? That's a big problem in our industry. So think in those terms. Think of like, especially when security practitioners traditionally have a bad rap of coming in and saying, oh, we absolutely cannot do that. The world will fall apart if we do it. And you're going to need to give me $1 million. Well, I don't want to hear that as a business leader. I want to hear, here's what we can do to maximize the business, to maximize revenue at the lowest risk that we're comfortable with. That's the conversation I want to have. So as you think about your mitigating strategies, whether it's software or anything else, keep that in mind. And to that point, COTS, commercial off-the-shelf software. We all use it. We all love it. And we will continue to love it and use it. Now, COTS comes with its own set of challenges. And just like anything else that I put in the hands of someone else, there is a loss of control. And that loss of control may provide an unacceptable security risk, or more often than not, it's unacceptable to us because we're security people, but the business is like, no, speed of business, speed of growing the business, doing whatever it is the business does will more often than not trump a risk that maybe is an impending doom, or if it was realized only hurts the business, say $100,000, where, going with this commercial off-the-shelf software solution in 30 days will make the business $500,000. So always just keep that in mind. One of the downfalls to COTS is, no, Microsoft is not going to tell you what's in the source code. Sorry, wish they would. I've been asking for years. And if you dig hard enough on the dark net, I'm sure you can find their source code. But that aside, they don't want to give you that visibility. So now we're going to talk about shared responsibility. No, we're a couple slides out from that. But the idea is that we got to work with them. We've got to do what we can do, and then we have to account for what we can't do. So if you can't tell me whether your stuff works or not, I might get a little more aggressive with my logging. I might be a little slower to give you certain accesses within the system. I might add an extra step. So again, COTS is risky because it is everywhere. Why does Windows have so many vulnerabilities? Because everyone has Windows, and it's huge, and it's a lot. Windows Event Viewer, no, not enough. Sorry, Corey. I wish that was true. But it's risky because it's well known, and there are generally common methods of attack, right? So remote code execution, DDoS, and because the source code tends to be, black boxed, there could be unwanted malware or functionality, right? Just know that exists and it's there, and we need to account for it. Risk assessments and mitigation strategies, just like anything else, are how we're going to decide what we're going to do about it. Open source or open source, depending how you want to pronounce it. Love open source. Don't love when open source is treated as safe as something that we built under rigorous standard. So before introducing open source into the environment, if possible, do some security testing on it. The nice thing about open source is you have the code. You can scan that code. You can build those projects in a test environment. You can do security testing on open source that you cannot do on COTS. Having said that, almost no one is doing it. Almost everybody's just calling the library, getting the functionality, pushing it to prod, and then, oops, I'll go back to Log4j. Log4j was a science project built by 2 students while in school. And that's all the further it was taken. And then everybody came along and said, we need some good logging. Well, here's this Log4j thing. Oh, great, let's do that. And before you know it, it's built into major flagship enterprise software that people are spending tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of dollars on. So big thing for open source. I like it. Make sure you evaluate it. Make sure you verify the integrity. Just because you pulled it from the repo doesn't mean it's valid. Make sure that you have hashing. If you can do hashing, right? If you're able to reach out to the original contributor or the current contributor on that code base and ask them, hey, what is the last known good published hash? And do that basic check. You could actually save yourself a lot of problems. The other thing I like to do is if I'm pulling an open source repo, I may check for change and not automatically deploy it to my prod until after I've had a chance to investigate what that change is, right? Open source is not going anywhere. And again, it's got a lot of great benefits, but we have to treat it well. Yes, Derek, you are correct. The U of M was banned, and Linus was not too happy about that. Another story for another day. Buy me a beer, I'll tell you all about it. Third party. All right, third party software. You brought in a contract firm to build that capability that your team was unable, unwilling, or unfunded to do. Generally, this is going to be custom built for your needs and your purpose with some type of exclusive use agreement. The big thing to understand about doing this is escrow. If you're going to work with an outside firm to do any software development for you whatsoever, that they are doing as an outside firm and not a contractor in your building, right? I want to separate that. Third-party contractor in the building who's working for you as a contract resource on your project is not the same as hiring this out to a development shop. If you use a third party, make sure your code goes into escrow. And this is the same kind of escrow, if you will, that you would do when purchasing a home or anything else. The idea is that you have a business contract that says all the source code is held by a third party. In the event that you go out of business, that something happens, breach a contract, whatever, I now own that code. That code belongs to me because I hired you to build it for my purposes. And our existing contract relationship is dissolved, and I want to make sure that that code is accessible to me. The only way to legally make that happen is through using an escrow agent. Managed services. Woo, we're getting close. All right, managed services. SaaS, IaaS, and PaaS. So software as a service, infrastructure as a service, platform as a service. Lots of great reasons for using it. I encourage you to read the NIST special publication 800-145 if you're unclear on what the cloud is. And if you ask me again, it's a bunch of Linux servers crying tears of data. But NIST put a lot of work into actually defining what it means. My buddy said it best. It's a computer you don't own and cannot control, but you use. But go ahead and look into those things. You need to be thinking about what those shared responsibilities are. When I'm using IaaS, that's generally going to be, you know, I'm using that cloud provider to provide me infrastructure in some kind of bare metal capacity. I'm responsible for the setting up of the operating systems, the configuring of the operating systems, installing the software, managing it, maintaining it, et cetera, et cetera. In a platform as a service, I am using something they already built. I'll pick on Microsoft. Their SQL Server, for example, platform as a service. They take care of everything, the backups and the log maintenance and the indexing and all that stuff. And I'm just consuming a database service. And then there's software as a service. So what Security Studio does, it's what Salesforce, there's lots of software as a service solutions, O365, right? Software as a service. That generally is going to be just I log in and use the software and I have no obligation or right to understand the security practices and how things are done and how testing is happening and these things. Generally, that vendor is going to say, no, thank you. I'm not telling you any of that. So understand that each one of these has a shared responsibility, and your cloud provider has a shared responsibility matrix on their website that will tell you exactly where those lines start and stop within the given services. Now, having said that, you should, as often as possible, assess and audit as much as you possibly can. We talked a lot in chapter 6 about compliance frameworks regarding cloud computing. You will give up a direct control, but ideally the thought is I give up the direct control, I get faster, cheaper, better stuff that I don't have to have overhead maintaining. A lot of times direct observation is not available. I will tell you though that I'm seeing an increase in the exposure of APIs that give you a more granular view into logging activities and other such things, because cloud providers are realizing that in order for us to meet the new compliance standards and the new regulation, especially if you're critical infrastructure or supporting it, I have to have that visibility or I can't use your cloud. So more to come on that, but keep your eye on it. And again, just make sure you're asking lots of questions. And if you get a SOC 2 as an answer for we do good security, say, that's cute. Now I'd like to do a proper risk assessment. I can pass a SOC 2 and be insecure. Make no mistake, the compliance and security are very different animals. And I can be very compliant and wildly insecure, but very rarely will I be insecure and not compliant. Guidelines and standards. So if you do not put frames of expectation and guidelines around developers, they will develop however they want, whatever they want, and it will work. And the business will be happy and you will be very sad because you now have a security nightmare in your hands. The way to prevent that is with guidelines. We expect a certain standard of quality in the code. We expect a certain level of security, etc. Having them clearly documented and enforced are very important. And James, oh, buddy, we got to talk. Administrative and technical controls a lot of times come out of this. So you can actually use coding guidelines and standards as an administrative and technical control. There's ways to do both. So important to know. Weaknesses and vulnerabilities in the code. We'll go through this really, really quick. Vulnerabilities are the presence of a software weakness or a bug, but it is not automatically exploitable. Weaknesses or vulnerabilities, tend to be more exploitable, but not necessarily one-to-one. And weaknesses can exist, but there's no practical method of exploiting them. So the weakness is not a vulnerability. There are also weaknesses that have non-security aspects, poor performance, things like that. Vulnerability is a way in which a weakness could be exploited. Non-security weaknesses are obviously not exploitable, but some insecure source code level weaknesses might be compensated by other parts. So you can actually do security controls around those weaknesses outside of the code itself. This example is using the memory manager to prevent buffer overflow. If you didn't write buffer overflow into buffer overflow protection into the code. So know that you have to test it. And I don't want to knock SOC 2, get one. It's better than nothing, but in and of itself, by itself, doesn't automatically mean. Basically, I'll say this on that because I see a little bit of action in the chat here. When it comes to risk decisions, whether it's a third-party vendor, software provider, hosting provider, whatever it is, Ask for as much detail as you can possibly get away with. It surprises me all the time how few people actually ask for more detail. So the sales guy goes, yeah, we got you. I got that SOC 2 report. And they go, okay, well, we got their SOC 2, but they never do the follow-up to go, hey, sales guy, can you put me in touch with an actual person that knows what they're talking about in your business? And because I'd like to ask them if I can conduct a third-party risk analysis, or can I come in and review? I see your SOC 2 and I love it. And I get that you don't want me scanning you, but can I send a representative to sit down with your people, with your internal audit team, and just look at a few things to make sure you're actually doing it? So, as much as you can ask. We are very close to the end. So security vulnerabilities, again, tracking. So CWE is the common weakness enumeration. It's a way of describing vulnerabilities. It's very similar to the CVE, which we'll talk about in a second. Basically, vulnerabilities have descriptions, extended descriptions, relationships, modes of introduction. In other words, how it gets into the system, application platforms, consequences, and demonstrative examples. There's observed examples, so CVEs, potential mitigations, detection methods, and miscellaneous metadata. All vulnerability systems, whether it's the common weakness enumeration or common weakness scoring system, or the other methods we'll talk about in a second, all have the same basic thing. What is it? What does it do? What does it affect? How do I deal with it? Does the vendor have any kind of fix they've published? All of that should be available to you. I'm not going to read all this stuff in the interest of time, but do look at this. So CWSS, base finding, attack surface, environmental. This is the things that they look at to come up with that base finding. So they quantify the technical impact with the acquired privilege, with the acquired privilege layer, so on and so on, and they come up with a number. Common vulnerability and exposures, or CVE, very similar to the CWE. Same thing here. They have some numbers. It describes what it's doing. Study these slides after the fact. I'm going to speed it up for us so we can get done here tonight. CVSS, same thing. It's a scoring system. It's going to tell you how impactful the vulnerability is, and it's based on a variety of factors that they calculate, such as the exploitability, the impact, and then if there's any sub-scoring. Generally speaking, the CVSS is the more common one that everybody uses. 0 is a non-event, 10 is a critical. You have to look at these things in context. OWASP has a top 10 practice. Definitely familiarize yourself with this. So when we're doing code, we want to look at things like injection, broken authentication, sensitive data exposure, any XML going to external entities, broken access control, security misconfigurations, cross-site scripting, deserialization, known vulnerabilities, insufficient logging and monitoring. These are the 10 big things that you run into all the time that represent what could produce a vulnerability. You want to look at the composition of the software itself. What open source components are in there, or free and open source, or FOSS for the acronym. You want to do a composition analysis. This is what the heck is my software made of? What are all the bits and pieces that make it up? And then you can use DevSecOps and CI/CD to automate a lot of this as well. APIs, or application programming interfaces. They're providing standardized access to features and systems without you having to understand what's going on behind it. A lot of times they're going to use HTTP or HTTPS as a means of communicating. You want to understand these things. Representation state transfer, or REST APIs, use URLs to surface data, and they use get and post commands for retrieving and sending data to the API. SOAP, or Simple Object Access Protocol, is another type of API. Generally, this is going to be for exchanging messaging between system components. Most cloud services are built around API foundations. So when you're interacting with them, you're generally doing that through API endpoints or user exposed URLs. Cheat sheet, go to OWASP, check it out, educate yourself on this. Some considerations for APIs: authentication, basic authentication, and key-based authentication. So one of them standard login, the other one is actually using a secret key, symmetric, and it's doing encryption. You also have certificate-based authentication. And this could be, again, using symmetric or public key, federated single sign-on. So if you have SAML or security assertion markup language using like OAuth or something like that, you can do federation to authenticate to the API. Big thing for APIs here, software in general, input, validation, and sanitization. Super important here. Am I taking in what I think I'm taking in? How do I know that I'm taking in the right thing? If I'm expecting a number, am I getting a number? That's all about input validation. Sanitization is about stripping out characters that could potentially break things. So for example, I don't like to see quotes in my text strings because that can lead to SQL statements being executed. So I might want to sanitize that. I'm going to do syntactic and semantic validation to check for data integrity issues. Again, if I have the escape character here, it's gonna possibly create a SQL issue. So I want to make sure I validate, sanitize. Good God, it's getting late. All right, we are almost done. APIs need to have the same security rigor applied to their access management as the systems they're interacting with. So you always want to be thinking about that confidentiality, integrity, availability. You want to use the same level of rigor for the system they're interacting with, same security controls wherever you can. They're generally designed for system to system. And so a lot of times nobody thinks about how they could be abused or used as part of an attack. They're often overlooked as part of threat modeling. Be better and think about them when you're doing your threat modeling. Protect the communications. So same thing here, right? We want to make sure those session keys don't get hijacked and that data is encrypted in transit and that we're using standards wherever possible. And always the level of security should be driven by the risk. And in this case, the risk of the sensitivity level of the data. No need to encrypt data that is public. No, by the same token, you want to encrypt data that is private, hence where we're going to cryptography. We also want to protect the cryptography, the confidentiality of the cryptography and the keys that we're using, the integrity of the hash functions. How am I doing this? Authenticity and non-repudiation, almost finished. And in the interest of time, access control, monitoring, logging, and alerting. Again, this is not new. This is just in the context of APIs. Testing of those APIs. So again, we covered a lot of that in domain 6. Make sure you're using those security tools where available. Use secure coding practices. This is going to help you a lot. So back to that guidelines and standards. That's how we get to secure coding practices. There are some documented cheat sheets for you with OWASP to help you make sure you're doing those things. And as you can see here, it's the basics. It's authentication and access controls, preventing common known vulnerabilities, using proper architecture, and any technology specific security guidance, such as HTML5, Docker, Kubernetes, or XML. Here's some standards for software development that you might want to look at. OWASP, again, great reference. These are the 13 categories. I will not read them. Carnegie Mellon, they're awesome. They write a lot of standards. Check them out. Education and culture, super important here. This one I am going to go through and we are going to close out. We are 10 slides from the finish line. Secure by design, super awesome. You need to do it. Secure by default. It is a culture. It's a practice. It's saying that our software will be designed and built to be secure by default and secure by design, and we will accept nothing less. DevSecOps is a way to make sure those things are happening and that you're enforcing them. Build security in, or the SAM or BSIMM that we talked about earlier tonight. Again, it's an idea that security shouldn't be an afterthought. It should be the first thought. Software-defined security is the future. This is how security is applied in virtualized environments and cloud service, things like software-defined networking. We also now have software-defined security. So making sure that we're doing secure development practices when we're building our software-defined security is absolutely critical. We want to look at things like enhanced availability. So what happens when my software-defined security doesn't work or is unavailable? Okay. Infrastructure neutrality. Am I building my things in such a way that I'm not creating dependencies to specific infrastructures, but that I can traverse different cloud providers or host OSs? Micro-targeting, that's getting very granular for specific enforcement and controls. Centralized management, again, this is taking more of that holistic approach. So software development security is trying to consolidate this and use standard control policies and control implementations. Active Directory or LDAP is the example. Standardizations, integrations, and automation, wherever you can do that. And then lastly, dynamic response. So that's that SOAR model we talked about. And with that, oh boy, here we are. We made it. Woo! We made it. Yeah. All right. Next session on Wednesday is going to be practice and some example tests. So check in on Wednesday. We're going to be going through, doing a little bit of a high-level review. We're going to be doing some practice exams. I appreciate everybody hanging on with me. I'm so sorry this ran long, but I had to do it that way tonight to account for all the incompleted courses over the week so that we can stay on schedule and get you guys back to track. If anyone has any questions, I know I moved through some of this pretty quick. Please hit me up in the Slack. I'm happy to respond to any of this. We have amazing folks here. We want to see you be successful. The decks will probably go out in the morning. Thank you all so very much for being here. Have a great night, and I look forward to seeing the questions from you soon.